We're live.
5 Historical Lessons for Anti-Fascists. This chapter briefly analyzes 5 lessons that many anti-fascists draw, or I believe should draw, from history. Each lesson begins with a more factual description of a given phenomenon before moving into an anti-fascist interpretation of the historical facts in question. Like all historical phenomena, these facts are subject to multiple interpretations. These are not the only lessons from this history, but they shed light on some of the historically informed underpinnings of anti-fascism. 1. Fascist revolutions have never succeeded. Fascists gain power legally. First, some important facts. Mussolini's march on Rome was merely a spectacle legitimizing his prior invitation to form a government. Hitler's beer hall putsch of 1923 failed miserably. His eventual accession to power came when President Hindenburg appointed him chancellor. The enabling act that granted him complete power was passed by Parliament. For militant anti-fascists, those historical facts have cast doubt on the liberal formula for opposing fascism. That formula essentially amounts to faith in reasoned debate to counteract fascist ideas, in the police to counteract fascist violence, and in the institutions of parliamentary government to counteract fascist attempts to seize power. There is no doubt that sometimes this formula has worked. There is also no doubt that sometimes it has not. Fascism and Nazism emerged as emotional, anti-rational appeals, grounded in masculine promises of renewed national vigor. While political argumentation is always important in appealing to the potential popular base of fascism, its sharpness is blunted when confronted with ideologies that reject the terms of rational debate. Rationality did not stop the fascists or the Nazis. While reason is always necessary, it is unfortunately insufficient on its own from an anti-fascist perspective. Thus, it's no surprise that history shows that parliamentary government is not always a barrier to fascism. To the contrary, on several occasions, it has been more of a red carpet. When interwar economic and political elites felt sufficiently threatened by the prospect of revolution, they turned to figures like Mussolini and Hitler to ruthlessly crush dissent and protect private property. While it would be a mistake to entirely reduce fascism to a last resort of an endangered capitalist system, that element of its composition played an important and at times decisive role in its fortunes. When interwar authoritarian leaders felt much less threatened, they often implemented fascist policies from above. For most revolutionaries, this means that anti-fascism must necessarily be anti-capitalist. As long as capitalism continues to foment class struggle, they argue, fascism will always loom in the background as an authoritarian solution to popular upheaval. As for the police counteracting fascist violence, at times the police have arrested and persecuted fascists, yet the historical record shows that along with the military, they have also been the most eager for a return to order. Studies show that high percentage of police voted for Golden Dawn and the Front National over the past few years. In the United States, it is clear that many police welcome Trump as a Blue Lives Matter president who would allow law enforcement to continue its harassment and murder of communities of color unimpeded. Recently, it was revealed that the FBI had been investigating alarmingly, though not surprisingly, high levels of white supremacist infiltration into law enforcement for decades. Moreover, regardless of the composition of the U.S. police force, the fact that it developed out of Southern slave patrols and Northern opposition to the labor movement gives us insight into its role in the white supremacist criminal justice system. All of which is to say that the fact that fascist revolts have always failed should not lessen concerns about fascist insurrectionism. The fascist strategy of tension in Italy, the development of the lone wolf concept of leaderless resistance promoted by the American Klan leader Louis Beam, and the fascist armed struggle that developed on both sides of the Euromaidan conflicts in Ukraine attests to the material danger of insurrectionary fascist violence. Nevertheless, historically, fascism has gained entry to the halls of power not by smashing down the gates, but by convincing the gatekeepers to politely swing them open. 2. To varying degrees, many interwar anti-fascist leaders and theorists assumed that fascism was simply a variant of traditional counter-revolutionary politics. They did not take it seriously enough until it was too late. As long as there has been revolution, there has been counter-revolution. For every storming of the Bastille, there was a Thermidor. After the Paris Commune, hundreds were executed and thousands imprisoned and deported. More than 5,000 political prisoners were executed and 38,000 imprisoned after the failed 1905 Russian Revolution, which also witnessed 690 anti-Semitic pogroms that killed more than 3,000. European radicals and ethnic minorities were by no means alien to the violence of traditional reaction. Yet fascism represented something new. Fascist ideological, technological, and bureaucratic innovations created a vehicle for the imperialism and genocide that Europe had exported around the world to bring its wars of extermination home. Unsurprisingly, many leftist commentators initially conceptualized fascism within the parameters of existing counter-revolutionary forces. According to the Workers' Socialist Federation, Italian fascists were, in the strictest sense, a white guard, referring to the counter-revolutionaries of the Russian Revolution. The Communist Party of Great Britain called them the Italian Black and Tans, referring to the British counter-revolutionary forces in the Irish War of Independence. In the 1920s, some Marxists used Hungarian communist George Lukács's analysis of white terror to argue that Mussolini's squadristi were merely a non-ideological bulwark of the ruling class. On the other hand, a number of commentators did highlight fascism's unique features. They recognized the novelty of its nationalist flirtation with socialism, its populist elitism. They observed how previously antagonistic sectors like traditional landowners and bourgeois capitalists could form a united counter-revolutionary movement. The Marxist focus on the underlying class dynamics of fascism revealed elements of this puzzling new doctrine that centrist observers failed to grasp. Yet that focus also tended to limit the potential danger that fascism could pose to the confines of its alleged role as bodyguard to the ruling class. And so Marxists and many others therefore failed to anticipate how the scope of its violence would greatly extend beyond that which was necessary to safeguard capitalist enterprise. Moreover, although interwar fascism developed out of mainly middle-class constituencies with upper-class backing, as fascist movements grew, they sometimes, though not always, attracted working-class support, a fact that Marxists were slow to come to terms with fully. Regardless of the content of their analysis, however, many socialist and communist politicians did not lead as if the very existence of their movements hung in the balance. The Italian socialists signed the Pact of Pacification with Mussolini in 1921, and neither they nor the communists thought that Mussolini's rise to power represented anything more than the latest rightward swing in the age-old rhythmic pendulum of bourgeois parliamentary politics. In that way, they were not entirely dissimilar to the majority of Spanish socialists who collaborated with Primo de Rivera's somewhat fascistic military government in the 1920s. In Germany, the communists believed that fascism had already arrived when the presidential governments of the early 1930s started to rule by decree. Yet neither the allegedly fascist presidential governments nor the chancellorship of Adolf Hitler convinced party leadership that they faced an existential threat. For the KPD leadership, fascism did not call for resistance by any means necessary, but patience. Their slogan was, "First Hitler, then us." At the turn of the century, leftists had reason to anticipate that years of repression would come and go. Fascism changed the rules of the game. The first substantive recognition of the instigated by Mussolini, the uprising was brutally suppressed, leaving 200 dead, 300 wounded, and the party outlawed. Yet their bravery inspired the Spanish socialist miners who rebelled later that year in Asturias. Their slogan was, "Better Vienna than Berlin," where Hitler's rise to power was not opposed by force. By the time the Spanish Civil War broke out, anti-fascism was widely understood to be a desperate struggle against extermination.
You don't want to push your hand there. That would work bad for
The
you.
tendency of leftist theorists and politicians to excessively conceptualize fascism based on the paradigm of traditional counter-revolution hindered the ability of the left to adjust to the new threat it faced. Since the shape of resistance must always be calibrated against that which is being resisted, it is incumbent upon anti-fascists to continually reevaluate their theoretical, strategic, and tactical arsenals based on shifts in the ideology and praxis of their far-right adversaries. Matthew N. Lyons put this lesson into practice by critiquing writers who argued that the alt-right should merely be called neo-Nazis. While many alt-right are clearly neo-Nazis, Lyons argues that this embodies the unfortunate idea that white supremacist politics are basically all the same, that we don't need to understand our enemy. Conceiving of the enemy in terms of a dated paradigm cost interwar anti-fascists dearly. At some point, the evolution of the far right might even mean transcending the framework of fascism altogether. As we move further and further away from the 20th century, it is essential for anti-fascists to develop a clear and precise understanding of fascism. Yet in order to understand the robust and flexible nature of anti-fascist politics, we must recognize the relationship between two of the many registers of anti-fascism, analytical and moral. The analytical register consists of mobilizing historically informed definitions and interpretations of fascism to craft anti-fascist strategy suited to the specific challenges of facing ideological fascist groups and movements. Methods of confronting neo-Nazi groups may not make sense against other far-right formations. Understanding the difference between them should inform strategic and tactical choices. The moral register developed out of the rhetorical power of the fascist epithet of calling someone or something fascist in the post-war period. It comes into play when the anti-fascist lens is applied to phenomena that may not be fascist, technically speaking, but are fascistic. For example, were the Black Panthers wrong to call cops who killed people with impunity fascist pigs if they did not personally hold fascist beliefs, or if the American government was not literally fascist? At a Madrid Antifa demonstration, I saw a rainbow flag with the slogan, "Homophobia is fascism." Does the existence of non-fascist homophobes invalidate the argument? Were the guerrillas who fought against Franco in Spain and Pinochet in Chile misguided to call their struggle anti-fascist, if, according to most historians, these regimes were not technically fascist? As we have discussed, it is important to analyze each of these cases and many more in order to develop a finely tuned analysis. Yet the moral register of anti-fascism understands how fascism has become a moral signifier that those struggling against a variety of oppressions have utilized to highlight the ferocity of the political foes they have faced and the elements of continuity they share with actual fascism. Franco's Spain may have been more of a traditionalist Catholic military regime than fascism per se, but such differences mattered little to those who were hunted down by the civil guard.
Chop the arm down.
The challenges of defining fascism make the line between these two registers blurry. Moreover, the analytical register contains a moral critique, just as the moral register entails a loose analysis of the relationship between a given source of oppression and fascism. While it is true that at a certain point the fascist epithet loses some of its power if it is applied too widely, a key component of anti-fascism is to organize against both fascist and fascistic politics in solidarity with all those who suffer and struggle. Matters of definition should influence our strategies and tactics, not our solidarity. 3. For ideological and organizational reasons, socialist and communist leadership was often slower to accurately assess the threat of fascism and slower to advocate militant anti-fascist responses than their party's rank-and-file membership. Since many socialists and communists initially considered fascism to be a variant of traditional counter-revolutionary politics, they focused on each other far more than their fascist enemies. Both factions reasoned that if they could unite the proletariat under their leadership, it wouldn't matter what right-wing obstacles they might face. Thus, while some rank-and-file socialists stayed with the Arditi del Popolo to fight against the black shirts in Italy in the early 1920s, the party leadership pulled out in order to continue along its legalistic electoral path. When that path was definitively blocked, the party struggled to change course. And similarly throughout the era, German socialists adhered to a strictly legalistic course in the 1920s and 30s, despite the increasing unease of party members. Although socialists in the Reichsbanner and later the Iron Front pushed for more aggressive measures, the torpid party apparatus was ill-equipped to consider alternative strategies. Likewise, the rank-and-file of Austrian socialism struggled to push their party leadership toward militant self-defense in the face of a far-right onslaught in the 1920s and 30s. In Britain, rank-and-file members of the Labour Party and the Trades Union Congress physically confronted fascists in the street despite their leaders' admonitions. Labour leadership even condemned its members who participated in the Battle of Cable Street. When various groups confronted Oswald Mosley's black shirts marching through the Jewish section of London's East End, and refused to support the many Labour Party members who joined the international brigades in Spain. As historian Larry Sepler argued, the Social Democrats had played their parliamentary game too long, and their leaders had become ideologically and psychologically incapable of organizing, ordering, or approving armed resistance or preventative revolution. Nonetheless, many individual socialists who were far less encumbered by legalistic party ideology and master plan electoral strategy seem to have been more sensitive to changing conditions on the ground and far more eager to take the fight to fascism. In the early 1920s, the Communist International believed that the most pressing task for the revolution was to draw a clear and antagonistic distinction between Marxism-Leninism and social democracy, so they could lead the insurgent wave that seemed to be engulfing the continent. This goal returned to the fore with the start of the Comintern's third period in 1928. The Leninist organizational model of democratic centralism dictated a disciplined chain of command from the Comintern in Moscow down through national parties to regional branches and neighborhood cadre. This model allowed the international communist movement to act in unison across vast geographic expanses. But it also often meant that internecine squabbles among party elite in Moscow had a greater impact on policy than local conditions. The social fascist line was one such example. Many national leaders adopted it grudgingly and abandoned it eagerly, with the commentary shift to the Popular Front policy in 1935. Rank-and-file communists and socialists generally did not hate each other nearly as much as their leaders did. In fact, early unity initiatives between socialists and communists in France and Austria, for example, developed from below. These examples demonstrate some of the drawbacks of hierarchical organization.
This way?
4. Fascism steals from left ideology, strategy, imagery, and culture. Fascism and Nazism developed out of the desire to free nationalism, militarism, and masculinity from the decadent capitalist bourgeoisie at the heads of the Italian and German governments, to capture collectivist popular politics of the degenerate socialist left. Even before Hitler took over, the German Workers' Party used a healthy dose of red on their flags and posters, and members called each other comrade. This produced anti-ideological, anti-rational paradoxes like national syndicalism and national socialism. Left fascists and Nazis were purged as their parties gained power and cozied up to the economic elite. But the nationalist co-optation of the rhetoric of working-class populism played a key role in getting them there. The Nazis created their own labor exchanges to provide jobs to the unemployed based on their good relations with businessmen. In some ways, this was a class collaborationist variation on the role of the union as a gateway toward employment in an industry. Nazi stormtrooper taverns clearly grew out of the tradition of socialist taverns dating back to the 19th century. The Nazis also provided free food and shelter for supporters amid the Great Depression. This was a marked departure from traditional conservatives who showed disdain for the poor and unemployed, and at most contributed occasionally to apolitical or religious charities. This model of far-right political charity has been adopted by the Greek Golden Dawn, the Italian Casa Pound, the Hogar Social Madrid, and the British National Action, all of whom have started giving out free food and groceries to ethnic Greeks, Italians, Spaniards, and whites only. Casa Pound activists started imitating autonomous squatters by occupying abandoned buildings. And Hogar Social Madrid not only started squatting, but even on occasion organizing against the eviction of ethnic Spaniards in a clear attempt to capitalize on Spain's vibrant left-wing housing rights movement. More broadly, post-war fascists continued to turn to the revolutionary left for strategic insights. The third position fascists sought to apply Maoist theories of third world revolution to the goal of European liberation, which would entail forcibly removing non-Europeans. In the 1980s, a faction of French Troisième Voie, Third Way, sought to use a Trotskyist strategy to burrow into Front National in order to take it over from within. Ukrainian fascists have sought to appropriate the legacy of the Ukrainian anarchist leader Nestor Makhno, while the Spanish fascist Bases Autonomas lauded the anarchist Buenaventura Durruti. Starting in the late 1980s and early 90s, though gaining force in the late 2000s, fascists across Europe have even started to copy the black bloc tactic of the German Autonomen. These black-clad autonomous nationalists, who sometimes use the anti-fascist flag's logo with National Socialist slogans or wear Palestinian keffiyehs, have attempted to mimic the appeal of the radical left by championing anti-capitalism, anti-militarism, and anti-Zionism in Germany, Greece, the Czech Republic, Poland, Ukraine, England, Romania, Sweden, Bulgaria, and the Netherlands. This tendency started to decline in Western Europe around 2013. National anarchism is another new variation on this theme.
So
National
you do that to me,
anarchists
it's impossible.
abuse the anarchist concept of autonomy
So you put
to
your
argue
hand
for separate, homogenous ethnic enclaves, including a whites-only homeland.
Stand here.
Many more examples could be cited,
Just stay.
but these are sufficient to demonstrate how anti-fascism is not only about venturing outward to oppose fascism,
Pull up on the
but also about guarding against the fascist creep,
Yeah.
as the title of Alexander Reed Ross's marvelous
Down
work
to the ground.
suggests.
Face.
They also demonstrate the importance of left ideology without establishing how they fit together. Concepts like autonomy, national liberation,
So I don't want that. I want
or even
to.
socialism,
Yeah.
and tactics like squatting,
I might grab my
organizing
hands.
food drives, or forming black blocs can be
So if you
co-opted
lay down to
under
the
our
ground,
noses.
Keep that knee bent. Lay down. Lay straight
It
back.
doesn't take that many
Now,
fascists
think about-
to make fascism.
Keep that knee bent.
Okay.
Keep that foot under my ribs.
In 1919,
Yeah.
Mussolini's
Pinch your
fasci
knees.
had 100 members.
Hold my arm.
When
Yeah,
Mussolini
hold
was appointed
my,
prime minister in 1922, only
my
about 7
femurs
to 8% of
with
the
your
Italian
femurs. Both of
population
your femurs are
and only
touching my
35
femurs.
of the more than
So
500
we
members
wanna
of
keep this arm
parliament
here. And now
belonged
think
to his
about,
PNF,
he's got a really strong
Partito
grip. So I'm
Nazionale
gonna grab my
Fascista.
hand like this. Relax a little
The
bit.
German
I'm gonna grab
Workers'
my hand
Party
like
only
this.
had 54
I'm gonna
members
hold
when
the back
Hitler
of the foot
attended
and I
his first
can't break
meeting
this
after the
thing
First
easy.
World War.
So think
When
about
Hitler was
rotating your
appointed
butt over
chancellor
like
in
this to sit on the other
1933,
side.
only about
No,
1.3%
keep
of
that
the
where it is.
population
You keep your legs
belonged
in
to the
place and you rotate your
NSDAP,
butt.
Okay, you shift.
the
it.
Nationalsozialistische Deutsche
So that you end up
Arbeiterpartei,
between your legs.
or
Rotate back.
National
Rotate back.
Socialist
Rotate
German
back.
Workers' Party.
So pinch my arms in your
Across
legs,
Europe,
first of all.
massive fascist parties emerged out of what were initially small nuclei during the interwar period.
Grab my
More
arm.
recently,
Put your foot
the
on my
electoral
ribs. Under my
success of
ribs.
many previously
Yeah.
minuscule
Now,
fascistic
you want my
parties
armpit in
after
your
the
balls.
financial crisis of 2008
Now,
the
you're already
recent wave of
folding this over here.
migration
Don't do that.
has
Keep it between
demonstrated
your
the
legs.
potential for rapid
Both arms
far-right
out. Sit up.
growth
Use your core.
when circumstances become
It sucks, but
favorable.
that's what you do. So
Yeah.
straighten this leg
Certainly,
across
these
my
parties
face.
grew
Now
and these
rotate
regimes
and put that foot
consolidated
in
their
my ribs
power
on this side.
by winning the support
And
of
straighten your other
conservative
leg and
elites,
rotate- oh,
anxious
put it back. Keep
industrialists,
that fucking foot on that side of my
alienated
body.
small
And
business
rotate your
owners,
ass over my face
unemployed
by fucking bouncing
nationalists,
off of my
and
head.
others.
I'm grinding over me like an asshole.
Triumphant
Don't be
post-war
nice.
resistance
Over
narratives
my head.
may have
Yes.
denied that any
Don't
of the
do
most
anything.
committed fascist
Now you gotta go up
ideologues
this arm.
supported
Keep your
figures
legs,
like
it's not a
Mussolini
bumper.
or Hitler.
Otherwise, you're
In
just
fact,
giving up a really
both
good position
regimes
for a
managed to
really
cultivate broad
Nope.
popular
See how
support,
his arm is here?
thereby
Yeah.
blurring our
Yeah.
understanding of what it meant to be a fascist or a Nazi in the
Yeah,
1930s.
think with your legs. Like
Uh-huh.
In
your
that
arms.
sense,
There,
it
that's where
took
you
quite a
put
few
that foot back.
fascists to
You
make
wanna go back to
fascism.
Rotate again.
The point
Put your
being
foot
made
in
here,
my
however,
ribs.
is that
Under my
before
ribs.
they achieved
Now
such
sit on
popular
it. Yeah, now
support,
rotate. No, put my
fascists and
put both of your
Nazis
legs.
were but tiny groups of
Yeah, there you go. It helps if you
ideologues.
straighten my arms like that.
Uh-huh.
But
Now rotate
meanwhile,
through.
it's important
Put your
to
foot on
note
my
that
ribs.
as Mussolini assembled a ragtag
Put my
group
ribs.
of 100 bitter
Rotate a little more.
veterans and quirky
Now,
nationalistic
now,
socialists,
Now
and
rotate
Hitler
back.
fought for
Now just do
leadership
it as a
of the
drill.
tiny
This
German
way.
Just do
Workers'
the
Party.
exercise of rotating
Italy
back and
and
forth over
Germany
my
were
head.
seemingly
Switch
on the
arm bars
verge
on.
of social
Keep on
revolution.
fighting in your life.
There is no reason for the left to have
Taking that weight
batted
on
an
my
eye
face.
at either development.
And then tuck it
These
into my
tiny
ribs as you
groups could
pinch my
not have
arm
been
with it,
more
the whole arm.
irrelevant.
And then you come
Even
around.
what
Yeah.
anarchists, communists,
And now-
and socialists
Yeah.
knew at the time,
So now,
there is no
Fold
reason for
my
them
arm
to
up.
have devoted any
Lean on
time
me
or
on me.
attention
Turn
to
this
the
into
early
lean on
days of
me.
fascism.
by putting the knee on me and
Yet
taking
one
the weight
cannot
over the
help but wonder
Yeah.
what might
Put
have
it all
happened
on.
if they had
Hold that
have.
arm up the whole time. Try
This
to
is
use
an
your core
impossible
strength. And
counterfactual
the
to
croup
address
is
seriously,
crushing me.
and
Yeah.
dwelling on
There's
it
all the
excessively
negative
omits the
If you're being
larger
nice to me,
societal
I'll
factors
stay- I'll
Yeah.
back
that set
that,
the
right?
stage
Lean
for the
back,
rise
put
of
that foot over
fascism.
there, pick up your toes on this
Nevertheless,
foot.
anti-fascists have concluded that since the future is unwritten, and fascism often emerges out of small marginal groups, every fascist or white supremacist
And
group
switch sides.
should be treated
So from
as
here,
if they could
knee
be
on belly.
Mussolini's
I'm gonna
100
put an
fasci,
ocean to defend.
or the
Put my
54
elbow
members
up,
of the
put
German
that arm
Workers'
under my
Party
far side elbow.
that provided
Put this
Hitler's
whole-
first
okay.
stepping stone.
Put that on.
The arms are.
The tragic irony of modern anti-fascism
And grab
is that
that
the
apple
more
and try to
successful it
take
is,
hand.
the more its
Turn it
raison
over, and
d'etre
grab it like
is
this.
called into
Turn it
question.
over,
Its
turn it over.
greatest successes lie in hypothetical limbo,
Right?
How many murderous fascist movements have been nipped in the bud over the past 70 years by Antifa groups before their violence could metastasize?
Right?
We
You
will
just
never
did this
know,
like very technical thing.
and that's a very good
So
thing.
now put the knee on belly on this side. Let go of that leg. Swing this leg off. Put the knee down. No, go back. Rotate.
Chapter 5.
Do it on this side. Knee down.
So much for the tolerant
Swing this
left.
leg back.
No platform and free speech.
Step it up.
The sacred tradition of free speech was under attack. The birthplace of the free speech movement of the 1960s, the campus of the University of California at Berkeley, was paradoxically said to be spawning a no free speech movement a half-century later. The embattled Berkeley College Republicans were under siege as first Milo Yiannopoulos and then Ann Coulter were prohibited from expressing their opinions by effing babies, as Bill Maher described them, who were carrying out what he called the liberals' version of book burning,
have to switch sides.
a horrifying alliance of masked hoodlums who arrived from off-campus, petulant students, and weak-kneed administrators, as various pundits described them, and turned universities into propaganda training grounds for the next generation of brown shirts.
Straight leg.
In another clear Nazi reference, a CNN commentator warned, if you don't stand up for Coulter's liberty today, someone will come for yours tomorrow. And more importantly, the Enlightenment will die a violent and pathetic death.
After you grind my face down.
The clashes of early 2017 brought the masked, self-styled anarchists bent on wreaking havoc, known as Antifa, into the public spotlight. Despite a complete lack of historical and theoretical knowledge, pundits concluded that anti-fascism is a greater threat to free speech than even fascism itself. But are anti-fascists enemies of free speech?
Starting here.
This chapter is a guide to answering this and other controversial questions pertaining to free speech and anti-fascism in the era of Donald Trump. Ultimately, I argue that though the ideology of anti-authoritarian anti-fascists promotes free speech far more than that of their critics, even their liberal critics, militant anti-fascism refuses to engage in terms of debate that developed out of the precepts of classical liberalism that undergird both liberal and conservative positions in the United States. Instead of privileging allegedly neutral universal rights, anti-fascists prioritize the political project of destroying fascism and protecting the vulnerable, regardless of whether their actions are considered violations of the free speech of fascists or not.
Nope. Get it down on me. Straight leg across.
How
And
free
then you tuck
is
that
free
foot in my ribs
speech?
as you come around and straighten the other
The
way.
terms of the debate often presume that anti-fascism is the only threat to an otherwise pristine state of free speech safeguarded by the
I should feel
American
it under my
government.
ribs right here, so that
It is
way I
imperative,
can't
however,
turn towards
to
you.
understand that the American
You have that
government
strong
already seriously limits what can
against
be
you. It's a
expressed
shield.
and who
It's
can
a
express it.
shield. Right?
Rightly
It
or
stops you.
wrongly, the government
I
has
might try
placed
to
a number
come
of
around it,
constraints on
But I won't be able
speech.
to if you got
It
my
restricts
armpit
false
and balls.
advertisement,
Hey,
libel,
up in your
and
groin.
television commercials for tobacco.
Now switch
It
sides.
prosecutes incitement to violence, protects copyrights, and it limits when and where pornographic images can be shown.
Keep the foot in the ribs.
Especially in
foot
times
ribs.
of crisis, Americans actually sympathize with restrictions of speech. This was evident in the aftermath of September
Climb up
11th,
under there.
when half the country favored press restraint and covering the
I should be able
Abu
to
Ghraib
look at
torture,
You should-
or in the fact
Imagine
that
the
journalists
place with
are
the
often
bucket of
arrested
ribs.
or harassed by police in protests, such as Occupy Wall Street and hashtag no DAPL, or that Trump's White House restricts access to oppositional reporters. This is why the United States only ranked at number 43 on the World Press Freedom Rankings in 2017.
This far on.
Readers will draw their own conclusions about the wisdom of these various restrictions, but regardless, they show that free speech absolutism, like many kinds of rights absolutism, is impossible in a society of overlapping interests.
Nothing I can do. I'm tired.
Such conflicts of interest have materialized most clearly in the American state's suppression of the free speech of left-wing social movements when they have grown strong enough to pose a threat. Recently, for example, Occupy Wall Street and Black Lives Matter protests have been brutally suppressed. Historically, hundreds of foreign-born radicals were deported, and anti-war agitators were imprisoned and assaulted by police during the Red Scare of 1917 to 1921. Leader McCarthyism blacklisted communists and other radicals. In the 1960s and 70s, J. Edgar Hoover and the FBI used illegal covert methods to violently shut down social movements in what was known as COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program. The corpses of murdered Black Panthers show how the government takes only a somewhat neutral stance toward free speech when it does not feel endangered itself. Moreover, if we take free speech not merely in terms of its legal status as enshrined in the First Amendment, but as a broader human value, we must recognize the complete rightlessness of the Guantanamo detainees, the de jure restrictions on the free speech of the country's millions of prisoners, and the restricted voting rights of many formerly incarcerated. All this, and not to mention the de facto restrictions on the speech of the country's millions of undocumented immigrants, most of whom are too fearful of deportation to express themselves, and the degree to which colossal disasters, like the wars in Vietnam and Iraq, have infringed upon the right to free speech and all the other rights of those who were killed. American alliances with dictators and support for military coups in Chile, Argentina, Brazil, Guatemala, Honduras, Haiti also demonstrate how promoting the value of free speech is far down on the government's list of priorities. The First Amendment is intended to protect non-incarcerated citizens from the government then, but not from the private sector. Free speech rights, such as the right to protest, are seriously curtailed in privately owned public places like shopping malls or Zuccotti Park during Occupy Wall Street.
Oh yeah.
Likewise, homeowners associations that manage condominiums have far more leeway to restrict the speech of their residents than the government. Corporate employees, like government officials, are often subject to non-disclosure clauses in their contracts that prohibit them from sharing privileged information, given what is clearly in the public interest. In the information,
If you're following
the
along,
power
drink
of
water.
tech companies to control the range and content of speech has been enhanced. As the historian Timothy Garton Ash points out, what Facebook does has a wider impact than anything France does, and Google than Germany. Yet the impact of tech companies on speech is really just the latest manifestation of the larger relationship between rights to speech and the underlying economic system. Free speech is often likened to a marketplace of ideas. Embedded in that metaphor is the American liberal notion that the key to combating extremism is to trust in the allegedly meritocratic essence of the public sphere. If all are allowed their say, then the good ideas will float to the top while the bad sink to the bottom, like live-action Reddit. Extremism, a seemingly innocuous term that centrists use to conflate Nazis with anarchists, jihadists with communists, arises when this natural process of discursive exchange is impeded. The conclusion is that the one who disrupts a fascist speaker brings us closer to fascism than the aggrieved orator who is actually advocating for fascism. This marketplace metaphor was popularized in the United States in the early 20th century by the Supreme Court Justice Oliver Wendell Holmes, who argued that truth could best be promoted by a free trade in ideas. Legal scholar C. Edwin Baker noted that the marketplace of ideas theory consistently dominates the Supreme Court's discussions of freedom of speech. In fact, the marketplace metaphor perfectly describes the power dynamics of free speech in a capitalist society, though not in the way that its proponents intended. Multinational corporations aspiring toward monopolistic control of capital and information establish the general confines in which the vast majority of humanity sell their labor and articulate their speech. The market of commodities is inseparable from the market of ideas, since ideas are commodified along with everything else in capitalist society. All non-incarcerated citizens may have an equal right to literally speak, but the ability to make that speech heard and make it matter is highly stratified. Support for campaign finance reform and opposition to the Citizens United ruling by the Supreme Court show how many American liberals agree about the conflicts between free speech and big money. Certainly the counter-argument is that free does not necessarily mean equal in either the market of ideas or of commodities. But this is where the question of meritocracy comes into the picture. The market concept is lauded for its ability to promote beneficial outcomes. When applied to the question of fascism, we must ask, can we trust that the marketplace of ideas will not elevate fascism to the forefront of the public sphere? Such trust sustains the perspective of liberals who agree with John Milton when he argued that society should let truth and falsehood grapple. Whoever knew truth put to the worse in a free and open encounter. Unfortunately, though, truth did not fare so well in interwar Europe. The horrors of the era were so catastrophic that for many, they definitively crushed the very modernist assumption of the steady upward progress of truth that undergirded Milton's optimistic assumptions. In fact, historically, fascist and fascistic ideas have thrived in open debate. Sometimes public discourse has been sufficient to squash fascism, but sometimes it hasn't been, which is why anti-fascists refuse to pin their hopes for the freedom and security of humanity on processes of public discourse that have already shown themselves to be fallible. Are anti-fascists anti-free speech? If capital and the state indeed render speech far less free than pundits generally presume, it's fair to compare the existing speech regime to that which most Antifa advocate. Anti-fascism is pan-revolutionary left politics applied to fighting the far right. Therefore, a number of socialist traditions coexist under this umbrella. Since the establishment of ARA and its growth in the 90s, most American Antifa have been anarchists or anti-authoritarian communists. Certainly some have been Stalinists and other kinds of authoritarians who have supported the efforts of the Soviet Union and similar regimes to very narrowly delineate the range of acceptable speech. From that standpoint, free speech as such is merely a bourgeois fantasy unworthy of consideration. Since I strongly disagree with the authoritarian position, which is only held by a minority of today's anti-fascists in the United States, I will not make any effort to defend it. Instead, I will observe that the anti-authoritarian position held by the majority of Antifa is actually far more pro-free speech than that put forward by liberals. The false assumption that the United States maximizes free speech rests on the unstated fact that this right only applies to non-incarcerated citizens. Therefore, millions of people in the United States are deprived of elements of this freedom. In contrast, anti-authoritarians seek to abolish prisons, states, and the very notion of citizenship, thereby eliminating this black hole of rightlessness. They also aim to construct a classless post-capitalist society that would eradicate significant discrepancies in our ability to make our speech meaningful and in the amount of time that we have to do so. By not devoting resources to prisons, police, and the military, such a post-capitalist society would be able to put far more into supporting education, the arts, and collective expression and inquiry. While the creation of a classless society would eliminate the majority of crimes stemming from capitalist antagonisms, Antifa argued that methods of restorative justice should
time. So, take a break.
Justice should replace police and prisons in addressing conflicts that persist. Rather than collaborating with oppressive regimes around the world, anti-authoritarians aspire to destroy them by organizing in solidarity with those who are actively resisting from below.
Practice.
The anti-authoritarian principle of individual and collective autonomy promotes a vision of human diversity and plurality at odds with the stifling homogeneity of capitalist consumer culture. If fascists were to start organizing in such a society, anti-authoritarian anti-fascists would still organize to shut them down, but they would not construct massive prisons to lock them up, as the American government has done to countless political prisoners over the generations. Many will argue that this is simply impossible. Even if that were true, however, what is at issue here are the values being espoused, not their likelihood of being enacted. Pundits attack Antifa for being anti-free speech. Yet even if you agree that shutting down fascist organizing constitutes an infringement upon the free speech of fascists, it is still patently obvious that anti-fascists advocate for far more free speech in society than liberals, both quantitatively and qualitatively. Do anti-fascists agree that no platforming fascists, that is, disrupting their public organizing, violates their freedom of speech? Some do and some don't, though most don't even publicly engage with the argument. When I asked the Dutch anti-fascist Jo Polak, he shrugged and smirked, saying it was a non-argument that we never felt we should engage with. You have the right to speak, but you also have the right to be shut up. Much of the Antifa reluctance to engage with this issue stems from their rejection of the classically liberal terms of debate that limit political questions about personal and group expression to the confines of legalistic, rights-based discourse. For liberals, the prime question is the status of the free speech rights of fascists. For revolutionary socialist Antifa, the prime question is the political struggle against fascism. From their perspective, the rights promoted by capitalist parliamentary government are not inherently worthy of respect. There are Antifa groups, however, that make an effort to publicly address the argument that anti-fascism infringes upon the free speech of fascists. Rose City Antifa, for example, points out that the right to free speech derived from the Constitution protects citizens from state interference, not from criticism by the public. We do not have a powerful state apparatus at our disposal. Therefore, the concepts of censorship and free speech rights are not in any reasonable way applicable.
So think about that.
Another popular argument that RCA and other groups make is that anti-fascism targets fascist organizing, not fascist speech. In a similar vein, Leeds AFA co-founder Paul Bowman argued that no platforming is more of an infringement on fascist freedom of assembly than speech per se. ARA co-founder and Twin Cities GDC organizer Kieran explained that he would take a very different approach toward a far-right co-worker if he were espousing his views as an individual than he would if he were attempting to organize.
Put that side down.
Nicolo from Milan made a similar point when he said, if fascists want to stay in their clubs shouting and drinking beer like pigs, let them do it, but don't let them come out. For Nicolo, however, the issue is less about speech versus organizing than public versus private, since he also explained that for us anti-fascists, fascists should never be allowed to speak in public, never. Other anti-fascists argue that no platforming does infringe upon the free speech of fascists, but is justified by virtue of their being fascists. An anti-fascist named Gautam, who who was active in a Midwest ARA group in the 90s, simply argued no free speech for fascists. Rasmus Presson from Denmark agreed, saying that the whole argument is a liberal construction, but that it is against the freedom of speech of fascist groups. In 1984, Tomahawk, the Scalp Bulletin, published an essay titled No Freedom of Expression for the Fascist Le Pen.
Yeah, I should put more shoulder into it.
Indiana Antifa argues that speech that hurts others is never protected speech. In its 2006 No Platform for Fascists statement, the Irish Workers' Solidarity Movement agreed with the distinction between organizing and individual expression, but argued that, as anarchists, we believe that there should be a right to free speech. This right, however, is not inalienable, and there are very limited occasions on which it should be curbed. Malamis Soteriou from Thessaloniki argued that the 2013 murder of Pavlos Fyssas made Greek society much more sympathetic to the notion of suppressing Golden Dawn propaganda. In early 2017, some Greek mayors even refused to welcome Golden Dawn MPs to their town or allow them to give public speeches. Militant anti-fascists oppose harnessing state power to suppress fascism because of their anti-state politics and their belief that any such measures would more often be turned against the left. Yet Soteriou explained how the actions of these mayors demonstrated that the anti-fascist movement has succeeded in passing this idea that there is no free speech for the neo-Nazis. When I asked Yorgos, one of the organizers of the Athenian anti-fascist motorcycle patrols, about the idea of free speech for fascists, he just laughed and said that the notion of no free speech for fascists is very clear here in Greece. This kind of debate is very American. Another Greek entity named Eliana Kanavali smiled, calmly explaining that anti-fascism can be summed up by the popular Greek expression, if a hand hurts, we chop it off. We don't discuss it. The perspectives that anti-fascists hold, or at least how they articulate them, vary by national context. Since most of the countries of continental Europe have laws against inciting racial hatred or Holocaust denial, impeding fascist propaganda is less controversial. The historical legacy of fascism and Nazism were far more powerful for people who had grown up under such regimes or had parents and relatives who had. Moreover, European left political culture is more inclined to conceive of the struggle against fascism in political oppositional terms as opposed to a test case for individual civil liberties. Personally, I find the argument that shutting down fascist organizing does not infringe upon the speech of fascists to be unconvincing. While it is essential to distinguish between the hateful comments of isolated individuals and the organizing initiatives of fascists, organizing constitutes speech, often literally. Not all speech is organizing, and therefore anti-fascists do not organize.
That's the energy motor. That's the thing.
Do not organize against speech per se, but much organizing is speech. If the tables were turned, this would be obvious.
So now we're going to start
If a fascist movement grew so powerful that it prevented leftists from gathering in public, and so threatening that collectively expressing anti-capitalist aspirations carried the threat of physical confrontation, we would rightly conclude that our speech was being curtailed. While it is true that the First Amendment focuses on protecting citizens from the government, when people argue that knocking over the podium of a fascist speaker violates her freedom of speech, free speech is usually understood as an ethical value, not simply a constitutional protection. Classical liberalism posits freedom of speech as a central tenet of its allegedly neutral ideology. Therefore, the debate revolves around the legitimacy of the universal principle that society should not limit speech on political grounds. When understood as a value rather than a law, it is clear that anti-fascism opposes this principle in its absolutist form, i.e., that all abridgments of speech are wrong. Instead, many anti-fascists make the illiberal argument, no free speech for fascists. From their perspective, the safety and well-being of marginalized populations is the priority. As Joe from the Raleigh-Durham GDC argued, the idea that freedom of speech is the most important thing that we can protect can only be held by someone who thinks that life is analogous to a debate hall. In my opinion, no platforming fascists often infringes upon their speech, but this is of how they articulate themselves. These anti-fascists value the free and open exchange of ideas. They simply draw the line at those who use that freedom to promote genocide or question people's humanity. It's important to note, however, that the vast majority of people who oppose limiting speech on political grounds are not free speech absolutists. They all have their exceptions to the rule, whether obscenity, incitement to violence, copyright infringement, press censorship during wartime, or restrictions for the incarcerated. If we rephrase the terms of the debate by taking these exceptions into account, we can see that many liberals support limiting the speech of working-class teens busted for drugs, but not limiting the speech of Nazis. Many are fine when the police quash this free speech of the undocumented by hunting them down, while they amplify the speech of the Klan by protecting them. They advocate curtailing ads for cigarettes, but not ads for white supremacy. All of these examples limit speech. The only difference is that liberals pretend that their limitations are apolitical, while anti-fascists embrace an avowedly political rejection of fascism. Anti-fascists reject the notion that politics can be reduced to the neutral management of disparate, atomized interests. They break through the liberal desire to confine the question to the realm of individual rights by foregrounding the ongoing collective struggle against fascism. When they say never again, they mean it, and they're willing to use any means necessary to make sure. In reality, liberal criteria for limiting speech are heavily steeped in the pervasive logic of capital, militarism, nationalism, colonialism, and the institutional racism of the criminal justice system, as well as the immigration system. Every time one or more of these factors limits the ability of human beings to express themselves, it is political. If one must be an absolutist to be considered pro-free speech, then 99.9% of Americans and the government that claims to represent them are anti-free speech. Rather than reducing a complex discussion to a Manichaean distinction between allegedly pro and anti-factions, it makes far more sense to compare competing criteria for limiting speech in the public interest. It is highly disingenuous and inaccurate to argue that anti-fascists are anti-free speech when no one actually lives up to the absolutist standard by which they are judged, and the society that anti-authoritarians aim to create would provide far more opportunity for far more people to freely express themselves than the status quo that their liberal critics defend. What about the slippery slope? The slippery slope argument is commonly used against restricting speech on political grounds in general, and against anti-fascism in particular. As Kevin Drum wrote in Mother Jones, whenever you start thinking these are good reasons to overturn, by violence or otherwise, someone's invitation to speak, ask yourself this: who decides? Because once you concede the right to keep people from speaking, you concede the right of somebody to make that decision. And that somebody may eventually decide to shut down communists, or anti-war protesters, or gays, or sociobiologists, or Jews who defend Israel, or Muslims. I don't want anyone to have that power. No one else on the left should want it either. So the question is, where do you draw the line? The argument rests on the assumption that there is no non-arbitrary line to be drawn. Once one starts down this path, the slope is so slippery that it inevitably slides into totalitarianism. Therefore, the argument goes, better not to start down it at all. At first glance, this argument seems especially convincing when it comes to fascism. If scholars and activists struggle to define a phenomenon that often branches out to garner the support of conservatives and to infiltrate leftist circles, then how is it possible to pinpoint the phenomenon with sufficient clarity to suppress it without endangering non-fascist discourse? This point is not entirely without merit, but despite some divergence in interpretation, anti-fascists generally agree on the broad strokes of fascism, such as patriarchy, white supremacy, authoritarianism, and so on. In practice, your average anti-fascists, risking their physical well-being and personal liberty to confront Nazis, are almost always much more well-versed in the nuanced distinctions between the various strains of fascism and their center-right counterparts than most self-righteous pundits. Furthermore, since militant anti-fascism usually develops out of defensive rather than offensive considerations, fascists usually establish a non-arbitrary line of political demarcation for the anti-fascists with their knives and fists. No platforming fascists only runs the risk of devolving into no platforming gays if you entirely divorce a tactic from its politics, a specialty of liberal commentators. But who decides? Kevin Drum asks in his Mother Jones article, and it's a fair question. This can seem a vexing question when assessed in an abstract analytical fashion divorced from context and politics. When addressed in a historical context, however, the contours of the debate are clearer. Efforts to deny a platform to fascists did not emerge from random individuals suddenly deciding that they disagreed with fascists and therefore wanted to silence them. Rather, they grew out of the historical struggle, often waged in self-defense, of movements of leftists, Jews, people of color, Muslims, queer and trans people, and others, to make sure that fascists do not grow powerful enough to murder them. This is the product of generations of transnational struggle, not a thought experiment. More fundamentally, however, this question revolves around the source of political legitimacy. Militant anti-fascism challenges the state monopoly on political legitimacy by making a political case for popular sovereignty from below. In so doing, it does not shy away from asserting the righteousness of anti-fascist politics. Rather than buying into the liberal notion that all political opinions are equal, anti-fascists unabashedly attack the legitimacy of fascism and institutions that support it. From an anti-fascist perspective, the question is not about establishing a neutral line beyond which right-wing politics cannot cross, but about entirely transforming society by tearing down oppression in all its forms. For revolutionary socialist anti-fascists, the question to ask is, who will win the political struggle? The fact that the specific circumstances of anti-fascist organizing never enter into the considerations of free speech critics demonstrates how they address the matter on exclusively analytical grounds. If, according to their analytical philosophizing, suppressing white supremacist organizing inevitably slides into suppressing everyone you disagree with, or sociobiologists, as Drum suggests, then it stands to reason This must have happened quite frequently over the past century of anti-fascist militancy. But liberal pundits don't even consider making such an empirical inquiry because they know so little about what they are talking about. They address the notion of no platform for fascists as if it were a new proposition that crazy radicals spontaneously decided to try out without any track record. If we take a look at the track record of anti-fascism, however, a consistent pattern emerges that is so familiar to anti-fascists that it's annoying. When local fascist organizing declines, so does local anti-fascist organizing. When the 43 group had sufficiently pummeled Mosley's fascist union movement into oblivion, they didn't turn their sights on conservatives, they disbanded. Writing in 2003, ARA organizer Rory McGowan wrote, "Where there is no visible or active Nazi presence, ARA groups fall into a state of inactivity. When Scout Besançon succeeded in shutting down white power shows being organized by the Blood and Honor satellite groups, Radical Corps and the Lyon Bunker Corps and the local Nazi movement dissolved as it turned in on itself. They didn't just turn to the next most conservative political group, they dissolved. After Norwegian fascism was largely stamped out in the late 90s, the country's Antifa have spent most of their time monitoring Swedish fascists with their Scandinavian comrades, rather than moving on to the next most right-wing political faction. The fact that the lifespans of most Antifa groups are determined by the activities of their fascist enemies is so well known that it actually constitutes a common critique of how Antifa organize. Many organizers lament the difficulty of maintaining membership when local fascist organizing is minimal. If anti-fascism is just about silencing those holding alternative points of view, then over the past 100 years, some tangible examples of Antifa groups sliding down this allegedly slippery slope should have been seen. Instead, the historical record points in the opposite direction. In addition, although I agree with militant anti-fascists that state bans of Nazis are not the way to go, European countries that have outlawed racial hatred, Nazism, and Holocaust denial, as fraught and hypocritical as these restrictions are, have not suddenly spiraled into dystopian authoritarianism as a result. The American presumption that political limits on speech are entirely untenable is not borne out by the evidence. The liberal alternative to militant anti-fascism is to have faith in the power of rational discourse, the police, and the institutions of government to prevent the ascension of a fascist regime. As we have established, this formula has failed on several notable occasions. Given the documented shortcomings of liberal anti-fascism and the failure of the Allied strategy of appeasement leading up to World War II, a more convincing argument can be made that allowing fascism to develop and expand runs the documented risk of sliding into totalitarianism. If we don't stop them when they are small, do we stop them when they are medium-sized? If not when they are medium-sized, then when they are large, when they're in government? Do we need to wait until the swastikas are unfurled from government buildings before we defend ourselves? Let's also take a step back to acknowledge that the worst case scenario that liberal critics fear entails the complete elimination of fascism and explicitly white supremacist organizing. How did that prospect become more horrifying than allowing such groups to flourish? A recent psychological study from the University of Kansas concluded that explicit racial prejudice is a reliable predictor of the free speech defense of racist expression. It's racists defending racists. This conclusion does not inherently invalidate the liberal argument, but it should encourage us to think beyond the mere principles under consideration to realize a very common underlying motive of racism. Finally, it's worth adding that militant anti-fascism is but one facet of a larger revolutionary project. Many Antifa groups organize not only against fascism, but aim to combat all forms of oppression, such as homophobia, capitalism, patriarchy. See fascism as only the most acute version of larger systemic threats. When I spoke with members of Pavé Brûlant in Bordeaux, they continually stressed that all major political parties in France manifested fascistic traits. They argued that the Front National serves to distract society from the fascistic qualities of other political parties. Therefore, although they focus on far-right groups, Pavé Brûlant is one of many Antifa groups that aims to combat fascistic politics wherever they emerge, as part of a holistic strategy.
It's perfect right here. You're in.
This does not mean that Antifa groups necessarily intend to apply the exact same tactics to larger and larger segments of the political landscape, but that anti-fascists are simply revolutionaries. It's surreal to watch liberal pundits lambaste anti-fascists for disrupting a fascist speech, when the revolutionary socialist ideology advocates the global expropriation of the capitalist ruling class and the destruction or capture of all existing states by means of an international popular uprising that most believe will necessitate violent confrontation with state forces. If they are critical of no platform, wait till they hear about class war. Mustn't truth be confronted by error? One objection to the no platforming of fascists, or restricting their speech in general, comes from the British philosopher John Stuart Mill's influential On Liberty. In this impassioned defense of free speech, Mill argues that even when the suppressed opinion is entirely false, unless it is suffered to be, and actually is, vigorously and earnestly contested, it will, by most of those who receive it, be held in the manner of a prejudice. According to Mill, the clearer perception and livelier impression of truth is produced by its collision with error. This would suggest, though, presenting pro- and anti-slavery perspectives, for example, as equally legitimate moral positions for society to consider. This, instead of teaching the Holocaust, slavery, or the genocide of indigenous populations through primary sources from slaveholders, Nazis, or colonists in a larger anti-racist, anti-colonial context, a way in which the anti-racist perspective would be enriched and deepened without reinscribing the violence of genocide and white supremacy through a vigorous and earnest contestation of the humanity of indigenous, Black, or Jewish people. Moreover, despite the rationalistic aspirations that drove Mill and his colleagues of the era, as Mills himself put it, the majority of what most people believe is always held in the manner of a prejudice. Few really examine the philosophical, political, and sociological underpinnings of their most deeply felt values. And even most who do are far less self-reflexive than they imagine. Societal norms are not changed through a rational process of analysis. They gradually transform through the ongoing struggle of competing interests, which are perpetually shaped by shifting economic and social factors. Though they certainly vary in how they interpret it, the widespread recognition on the part of most people that racism is wrong developed out of generations of struggle by people of color. Today, this notion pervades society, along with the historical agreement that slavery and the Holocaust were grave atrocities. Ideally, everyone would devote a significant amount of time and mental energy toward internalizing why these tragedies occurred and how they reflect upon history. But since most people won't engage in such reflection, the success of social movements in establishing baselines of anti-racist sentiment and the passive prejudices of society represents an important bulwark against the attempts of the alt-right to shift the center of gravity toward passive prejudices of white supremacy. Passive anti-racism is preferable to active white supremacy.
I got too close to the wall.
Doesn't no-platforming fascists erode free speech in a way that hurts the left more than the right? If taken in a legalistic direction toward promoting bans of government-disapproved speech, then it certainly does. For example, the British Public Order Act was used against the National Front, but also against the miners' strike of 1984 to 1985. European countries such as Germany have laws against Nazism and Holocaust denial, but they also often restrict revolutionary language on the left, which is why German anti-fascists consider state power to be an enemy, not an ally. That is why German Antifa seek to shut down fascist organizing through direct action rather than appealing to the state. In any event, regardless of what the left argues, the historical record is pretty clear that the state will invent an excuse when it needs one. When the radical left threatens elite interests, repression has and will come, plain and simple. One might argue that militant anti-fascism erodes public support for free speech, which would therefore reduce public support for the left when persecution arises. But the anti-fascist argument is not primarily about the strategy of no platforming. It is fundamentally about understanding fascism as a political enemy with which we cannot coexist. Even that political argument is really only a stepping stone toward promoting revolutionary socialist consciousness more broadly. If anti-fascism is working, then the left is growing larger and more powerful, which is the key to resisting repression. Shutting down Nazis makes you no better than a Nazi. Since Nazis and other fascists are known historically for shutting down the events of their leftist opponents, some argue that anyone who shuts down a political event, even if that event is a Nazi event, is therefore a Nazi. Fascists are also known for being nationalists, starting wars and building prisons. So does that mean anarchists can accuse liberals who share those qualities of also being fascists? Clearly, you can't define an ideology based only on a sole attribute. Despite the fact that liberals endorse infringing upon free speech far more than most anti-fascists, they imagine themselves as guardians of free speech, and therefore attack the illiberal politics of anti-fascism by folding it into the illiberal politics of fascism. If your main objection to Nazism is its suppression of the meetings of the opposition, then that says more about your politics than about those you are critiquing. Anti-fascists don't oppose fascism because it is illiberal in the abstract, but because it promotes white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, ultranationalism, authoritarianism, and genocide. What about anti-fascist principles in the university? Since the 1960s, waves of popular social movements, from the civil rights movement to the gay and lesbian movement to the more recent mobilizing for transgender rights, have pushed universities to become more inclusive and diverse. Although most American liberals infuse the notion of diversity with anti-racist and anti-sexist political content, when the term diversity is understood as an apolitical abstraction, it can be taken in reactionary directions. For example, in Time magazine, the director of the Conservative Young Americans for Liberty lauded the advance of racial and gender diversity in higher education because, he argued, diversity of thought, understood as laissez-faire speech, is an analogous social good, even if that speech is intended to roll back racial and gender diversity. He uses the apolitical abstraction to undermine the political content that progressives have attempted to invest in the term. It only emphasizes the point. Despite mainstream portrayals of campus social justice victories as apolitical updates to our collective morality, each generation that has pushed administrations to establish ethnic studies departments, to form women's and gender studies departments, to hire more faculty of color, has known that these struggles and the values they promote are entirely political. These advances do not represent a more perfect neutrality, but rather the adoption of certain basic feminist and anti-racist principles. As universities were increasingly forced to care about diversity, their gradual adherence to the demands of the marginalized became opportunities to sell their profit-driven institutions in a new market of liberal pluralism. But institutional commitments to providing resources and support for LGBTQ students, or the establishment of African cultural houses, or the creation of scholarships for undocumented students are entirely hollow if the very same institutions also provide space for individuals and groups that not only deny the humanity of those populations, but are actively organizing movements to physically deprive them of their existence. How can a university publicize the mental health resources it offers for trans students and then allow Milo Yiannopoulos to publicly incite hatred against a transgender student? If universities did not claim to have any normative values, there would be no contradiction. Yet those of us who have spent years on campuses across the country know how liberal multiculturalism has been institutionalized, and perhaps more importantly, monetized. Administrators don't get to say they care about the marginalized when schmoozing with donors, while they're also supporting the right of bigots to preach about the biological inferiority of those same people. NYU Vice Provost Ulrich Baer rightly argues that free speech protections end when they mean that someone's humanity or the right to participate in political speech as political agents can be freely attacked, demeaned, or questioned. Attorney Noah Shawbaker also points out that universities have a legal obligation to ban speakers like Yiannopoulos in order to conform to the mandates of Title VI and Title IX, which require schools to eliminate discrimination based on gender and race. Regardless of such legalistics, however, the right to call into question the humanity of others has consequences. On May 20th, 2017, a white supremacist student at the University of Maryland who belonged to an alt-right Facebook group fatally stabbed an African-American student named Richard Collins III. This murder followed an escalating series of racist propaganda and nooses around campus following Donald Trump's inauguration. Many Maryland students connected the dots between the administration's milquetoast attitude to the racist flyers, calling hate speech free speech, and Collins' murder. Fighting back against white supremacist violence on campus requires our movements to push institutions of higher education to openly and unequivocally embrace anti-racism.
Turn it over and chop it down. Follow all the way.
Chapter 6.
I'm gonna have my hands up.
Strategy, nonviolence, and everyday anti-fascism.
So I come up and I chop down.
Okay.
And I use the
Hey, are you part of the White Knights? A young Native American skinhead graffiti artist named Gator shouted across the street to a young white skinhead. Gator crossed the street alongside his 16-year-old sidekick Kieran and asked again, "Are you a White Knight?" The White Knights were a new white power skinhead group that, not long before, in the late 1980s, had started terrorizing punks and people of color in Minneapolis. Gator and Kieran were part of a small anti-racist skinhead crew called the Baldies that decided to stand up to them. Over time, members of the Baldies would create anti-racist action, which would eventually expand into a national network. But well before such large ambitions could bloom, Gator was teaching Kieran a genius strategy for confronting young, impressionable white supremacists. "So are you?" Gator asked. "Yes, I am," the kid responded. Taking a step closer, Gator explained that the next time he saw him, the answer had better be no. 30 years later, Karen marveled at this strategy that gave teens a chance to think about their stance and let them know that it carried consequences. It gave them fair warning. In fact, this strategy caused several white power skins to switch over to the Baldy's crew, an outcome that would have been far less likely had they been attacked immediately. This is a story about violence where punches were not thrown, about how making the consequences of racism known at the outset can nip white power in the bud. This is a story that shows how thoughtful many anti-fascists have been about violence and how effective carefully crafted threats of its application can be. Despite the media portrayal of a deranged, bloodthirsty Antifa, or the alt-right petition that developed after the anti-Milo Yiannopoulos protest to have Antifa declared a terrorist organization, as if Antifa were even an organization, let alone terrorist, the vast majority of anti-fascist tactics involve no physical violence whatsoever. Anti-fascists conduct research on the far right online, in person, and sometimes through infiltration. They dox them, push cultural milieu to disown them, pressure bosses to fire them, and demand that venues cancel their shows, conferences, and meetings. They organize educational events, reading groups, trainings, athletic tournaments, and fundraisers. They write articles, leaflets, and newspapers, drop banners, and make videos. They support refugees and immigrants, defend reproductive rights, and stand up against police brutality. But it is also true that some of them punch Nazis in the face and don't apologize for it. In fact, more than anything, it was the anti-fascist punching of Richard Spencer on Inauguration Day 2017 that catapulted the question of anti-racist violence into the national spotlight.
I know I'm a bad striker.
Yet even when somewhat sympathetic, most coverage of the act and the politics surrounding it reduced anti-fascist violence to the purportedly trivial individualistic act of Nazi punching.
Big push, right on my head.
In the era of memes and GIFs, Nazi punching was presented as a short-sighted fad. It was written about in a vein similar to the frenzy surrounding the 2013 knockout game, where a small number of teens were punching random people for fun. In a Newsweek interview, Randy Cohen, formerly the ethicist columnist for the New York Times Magazine, epitomized the tendency to interpret anti-fascist violence as superficially as possible by arguing that the Holocaust occurred not because people failed to punch Nazis. Instead, Cohen advocated following Gandhi's example or King's example without resorting to the gutter tactics of people like Spencer. In truth, violence represents a small, though vital sliver of anti-fascist activity. There are three main arguments that anti-fascists use to justify their occasional violence. First, as explained in Chapter 4, anti-fascists make a historical argument based on the accurate observation that rational debate and the institutions of government have failed to consistently halt the rise of fascism. Given that fact, they argue that the only hope to prevent a sequel is to physically prevent any potential fascist advance. Second, they point to the many successful examples of militant anti-fascism shutting down or severely hampering far-right organizing since the end of World War II. Third, fascist violence often necessitates self-defense. Although anti-fascists challenge conventional interpretations of self-defense, grounded in individualistic personal ethics, by legitimating offensive tactics in order to forestall the potential need for literal self-defense down the line. In other words, anti-fascists don't wait for a fascist threat to become violent before acting to shut it down, physically if necessary. As Murray from Baltimore ARA explained it, you fight them by writing letters and making phone calls so you don't have to fight them with fists. You fight them with fists so you don't have to fight them with knives. You fight them with knives so you don't have to fight them with guns. You fight them with guns so you don't have to fight them with tanks. This chapter will explore the main contours of the current debate surrounding no platforming and anti-fascist violence. Are liberals right that confronting fascists only makes them grow stronger? Should we just ignore them? If so many people glorify fighting Nazis in the 1930s and 40s, why do they disparage confronting them today? Does research really show that violence only plays into fascist hands? After answering these questions, I will discuss the danger of machismo, the fetishization of violence, and the role of feminism in anti-fascism. Next, I will address the relationship between militant anti-fascism, popular politics, and public opinion. Can black blocs and popular struggle coexist? Finally, I will explore the possibilities of everyday anti-fascism in the age of Trump. From Tom Hanks in Saving Private Ryan and Brad Pitt in Inglourious Bastards to Indiana Jones, nothing seems to delight American moviegoers more than killing Nazis. As the epitome of historical evil, seemingly any form of punishment unleashed upon the fascist body, whether baseball bats to the head from Tarantino's Bear Jew, or airplane propellers slicing up a German mechanic in Raiders of the Lost Ark, elicits a cathartic delight at the unleashing of vengeful justice at a very safe chronological and spatial distance. Since World War II is the least controversial war in American history, few dispute the legitimacy of fighting Nazis in the late 1930s and 40s. But would those same moviegoers consider it just as heroic to fight Nazis before the outbreak of war, while Hitler's regime was building camps and ghettos, or before Hitler even took power in 1933? How would Americans respond to a cinematic depiction of communist and social democratic organizations, such as the Red Front Fighters League, the Iron Front for Resistance Against Fascism, and Antifascistische Aktion, when they fought the Nazi Sturmabteilung in the 1920s and 30s? I like to imagine most Americans would sympathize with those militant formations because they know that the story ultimately ends in the gas chambers. So why then are so many Americans allergic to not only the prospect of physically confronting fascists and white supremacists, but even non-violently disrupting their speeches in favor of a Fourth Reich? There appear to be several reasons. First, most people have an all-or-nothing understanding of fascism that prevents them from taking fascists seriously until they seize power. Despite all of the hand-wringing about Trump the fascist from center-left commentators and enraged Clinton supporters, very few really believe that there is any serious chance of a fascistic regime ever materializing in America. Since most people tacitly conceive of fascism exclusively in terms of entirely totalitarian regimes, the prospect of fascism becomes an all-or-nothing proposition. While this skepticism toward the imminent potential of an explicitly fascist government in the United States is justified, Antifa argued that we should always remember that few took seriously the small bands of followers around Mussolini and Hitler when they started their ascent, and therefore we should remain vigilant against any and every manifestation of fascistic politics. Lack of concern over such a possibility is reinforced by the prevalent tendency to sever past eras of history, such as the Nazi regime or the Jim Crow era, from the present. Once their contributions to contemporary politics are reduced to moralistic aphorisms, the real thrust of their historical example and the elements of continuity between eras are considered irrelevant to current social struggle. Moreover, the probability of an actual fascist government is actually beside the point in terms of everyday organizing. Fascist violence is not an all-or-nothing proposition. Even in relatively small doses, it can be quite dangerous and therefore deserves to be taken seriously. This is painfully obvious to the victims of transphobic or anti-immigrant violence, for example. Second, many people ascribe to a kind of liberal anti-fascism, whether they know it or not. By liberal anti-fascism, I mean a faith in the inherent power of the public sphere to filter out fascist ideas, and in the institutions of government to forestall the advancement of fascist politics. If these factors were sufficient to protect everyone from fascist violence, then why would anyone bother confronting Nazis? As outlined in Chapter 4, however, anti-fascists point to the legal seizures of power by Mussolini and Hitler as examples of the fallibility of reasoned argument in parliamentary government to forestall fascism. This is not at all to say that there is no value in political argumentation. The attraction of far-right ideology often glistens brightest when the left fails to win the victories necessary to address popular needs and promote its own ideological perspectives. Resisting fascism requires not only anti-fascist organizing, but organizing on all fronts. Yet anti-fascist argumentation is only useful for those who might be sympathetic toward fascism, its potential popular base, rather than ideal who have nothing but disdain for the very terms of debate. When militant anti-fascists successfully deprive fascists or white supremacists of a platform to promote their agenda, liberal anti-fascists often argue that shutting them down is counterproductive because it only gives them more attention and allows them to play the victim. If they really have nothing of value to offer society, the argument goes, then that will be borne out.
Oh, no, that is number 4.
Let's examine the merit of this argument when applied to two common cases. One, small fascist organizations attempting to recruit, and two, far-right celebrity speakers. The first and perhaps most important point to make is that most anti-fascist organizing is literal self-defense. Most of the Antifa groups that formed in the 80s and 90s consisted of punks and anarchists who had to defend themselves from a growing white power skinhead menace. It's fine for commentators to pontificate about just ignoring them, but when they are coming at you with clubs, screwdrivers, or knives, it's not that simple. Even if we put the anti-state politics of most Antifa aside for the moment, it's clear that self-defense is legitimate when the police are absent or sympathetic toward fascist aggressors. What about when fascists do not pose an immediate physical threat? Is it better to ignore small, harmless fascist groups? By now, it should be clear that small fascist groups do not always remain that way. In Greece, Golden Dawn burst out of nowhere to become a major force poised to lead a government before criminal charges decimated party leadership in 2013. And they may yet bounce back. We can never be sure. Clearly, it is incumbent upon us to do what we can to prevent such groups from growing. To do so, it's essential to understand how they grow when they do. Leftist organizers often find this task to be much easier than liberal pundits because they are immersed in the mechanisms of movement building. They understand that to develop, movements need to hold public events, go on marches, pass out propaganda, publish newspapers, launch campaigns, form alliances and coalitions, and establish public offices, social centers, and bookstores. They must establish attractive social and cultural milieu that give new recruits a sense of belonging and a desire to commit to the struggle. For those who have spent years building this infrastructure and weathering the inevitable ebbs and flows in enthusiasm, commitment, and momentum that movement building entails, it is obvious that the consistent inability to accomplish some or all of these political tactics would be devastating. After all, fascism has demonstrated that systematically crushing the public presence of an opposing movement can work very well. The spectacle of shutting down fascists may give them more attention in the short term, but such actions deprive them of the ability to capitalize on that attention.
1, 2, 3.
Moreover, the spectacle of shutting them down, like all media spectacles, inevitably fades as it becomes more regular.
So,
The first time anti-fascists shut down Nazis, it's newsworthy. The 50th time, not so much.
Give it a try. Turn towards
Certainly,
you.
fascists always play the victim when they are shut down. Yet they also play the victim when they are not.
Stepping forward.
Fascism was built on fear.
In the arms.
Fear of Jews, communists, immigrants, Freemasons, homosexuals, national decadence,
Step together.
aesthetic modernism,
Keep
white
swinging.
genocide,
Don't
and
change
so on.
direction halfway. Do just
No matter how the left treats fascists, they will always present themselves as aggrieved victims.
So you change directions right now.
The vast majority of those who would be significantly swayed by fascist claims to victimhood
Now go up.
would respond positively to such an appeal under any pretense. Anti-fascists argue that any rhetorical benefit gained from such confrontations is outweighed by their reduced ability to disseminate it.
Front one goes forward, back one goes
It is
back.
true that the dynamics of no platform have changed significantly with the advent of the
You
internet.
started to change direction.
The internet is a platform that anti-fascists cannot completely contest, though efforts to persuade Reddit and other forums to ban racist threads have borne some fruit. Yet leftists who have worked on internet
That's how
propaganda
you do it.
realize that it can only go so far in sparking a mass movement without some kind of real-world corollary.
Opposite direction.
That is why Antifa argued that it is imperative to confront the alt-right as they attempt to step out from behind their screens
Let's start
to
facing up.
establish a public presence, something that would make their internet propaganda all that much more potent.
Front arm forward.
Liberal pundits fail to fully grasp the importance of movement infrastructure because their opinion manufacturing profession ascribes supreme importance
Quarter.
to the communication of ideas and abstraction.
Quarter.
But the conditions under which ideas are communicated matter a great deal.
Quarter.
Organizers know that it is difficult to maintain the commitment of movement participants
Four.
even when things are going well and there is little opposition.
4.
But if participation meant constant physical confrontation,
Count to 5.
technological harassment, and social ostracization,
1.
it would be exponentially more difficult to recruit.
Okay.
This is what my DC Antifa source Chepe calls the "it's not worth it" principle. Since new fascists come looking to identify with the most powerful kid on the block, Chepe explained that in his experience, when they are defeated in conflict or find their brethren run off, they feel like it's not worth it, and a lot of them leave.
2.
In the course of my interviews and
This is
research,
just one.
I found a
That's why
litany
I'm,
of cases
this
where
is the last one.
combinations
This is
of physical confrontations,
Put the body
doxing,
coordinations,
infiltration, and other anti-fascist tactics have succeeded in shutting down or severely hampering local and national fascist organizing.
Disappointed that, except when I'm
While it's important to remember that history is never monocausal,
and also
that anti-fascists may at times inflate their role in eliminating certain far-right groups,
here.
and that there are also examples of anti-fascists failing to shut down fascist activity. A relatively small sampling I gathered of successful campaigns shows that Antifa methods very often work, and work well.
3.
In the 1940s, the British 43 Group succeeded in shutting down Mosley's Union movement. The massive anti-Nazi League played a huge role in derailing the National Front in the UK in the late 70s and early 80s.
And then you come down.
Anti-fascist punks and skins across North America and Europe recounted how they overwhelmingly pushed Nazi skins out of their scene.
Now from here, I'm gonna step
Literally
into this.
thousands of white power shows have been canceled. Most of those that have occurred have been carried out clandestinely.
When I swing my bottom arm
Norwegian
up,
Antifa successfully abolished their fascist movement in the 1990s.
Oh, here, there, I'm sorry.
ARA played an important role in sabotaging the National Front and the World Church of the Creator by the early 2000s.
Turn around.
Annual Nazi marches in Dresden, Roskilde, and Salem were eventually shut down, causing many of the groups behind them to fracture.
That's it, right? Turn
Street
around.
confrontations stifled Denmark's National Front, and doxing broke the Danish front. AFA shut down the British National Party in Lancashire through successful repeated physical confrontations. Scout Besançon shut down 2 different local groups of Bloc Identitaire, and then the spotlight they shone on the Front Comtois, its successor formation, led the authorities to ban the group. Even when Dutch anti-fascists were badly beaten back by fascists from the Nationalistische Volksbeweging, NVB, on one occasion in 2007, the police intervened and arrested the fascists on weapons charges, which caused the group to turn in on itself and subsequently collapse. I could go on, but there is no need. Similar stories can be told in towns and cities around the world. Meanwhile, although anti-fascist no platforming has traditionally not been applied to individual far-right celebrity speakers, today it has become a highly publicized facet of American anti-fascism. These famous speakers pose different challenges for organizers. By virtue of their fame, figures like Milo Yiannopoulos or Ann Coulter have a platform to express themselves to millions. Yiannopoulos' fame did indeed soar after he was shut down in Berkeley, and Coulter was more than happy to be shut down by the free speech-hating liberals of Berkeley. For these reasons, commentators concluded that the black-clad rioters served Yiannopoulos' ultimate interests by putting him in an undeservedly sympathetic light. One writer argued in the Telegraph that resorting to violence is particularly stupid, given that Yiannopoulos' celebrity relies on reactions which are as outlandish as his personality. Even on the left, Christian Parenti and James Davis argued that the right had judo-style baited the campus left into bumptious overreactions in their effort to shut down the likes of Yiannopoulos and Charles Murray because of his racist 1994 book, The Bell Curve. The first point to make here is that the speakers and their careers are only part of the consideration. If shutting down Yiannopoulos or Coulter prevented a single undocumented or transgender student from facing harassment or worse, as happened when Yiannopoulos spoke at UW in Milwaukee, then it was worth it. The definitive end of the Nazi House came when Gunnar Graham's 80-year-old half-sister Edith Craig from Butte, Montana, successfully sued for the right to the building because the Nazi witnesses to Graham's wills were its beneficiaries, which was in violation of Danish law. The Danish protesters sang, "We shall overcome" at the victory celebration in Craig's honor. The anti-fascist dictum, "No platform for fascists," also applies to their posters, graffiti, and other propaganda. Anti-fascists place a great deal of emphasis on controlling public space in all senses. Therefore, they devoted significant amount of energy to eliminating any public trace of fascism. For instance, in early 2016, a group called the Antifa Sisters formed in response to neo-Nazi attacks on autonomous spaces in Slovenia. The sisters' playfully creative style of covering up fascist graffiti was on display in their Ghostbusters parody video, where they used a graphometer to determine levels of right-wing wall contamination. In Warsaw, Poland, over the last few years, a group of anti-fascists organized regular anti-fascist graffiti outings to strike back against a growing far-right presence. The first time they did it, they planned for a month to make sure they were prepared for any possible confrontations with fascists, the police, or overzealous neighbors. They drew a map to determine the 5 most important locations to hit, gathered supplies such as spray cans, gloves, easily disposable clothing, and pepper spray for self-defense, and even practiced getting in and out of the car quickly. When the night came, there was one encounter with some nationalists who threw bottles at them, but things basically went smoothly. They changed fascist slogans like "Poland for the Poles" to the phonetically similar absurdist slogan, "Soil for potatoes."
Yeah.
A Serbian Antifa named Stefan waged a similar campaign on his own in 2012. When he came upon wheat-pasted posters from the fascist Serbian action in his neighborhood of Belgrade, he immediately tore them down and noticed them back up again an hour later. He retaliated by plastering Antifa stickers all over the Serbian action posters, only to find Serbian action stickers in favor of traditional courtship and marriage and other conservative slogans plastered on top of his stickers in response. Every day for 6 months, Stefan battled with an anonymous fascist for control of his neighborhood. About 4 months into the conflict, Stefan saw a guy putting up a sticker down the street as he got off the bus. The two locked eyes, but Stefan wasn't sure if this was his nemesis. In any event, Stefan persisted, and eventually the Serbian action propaganda ceased to appear. He simply outlasted them. Serbian anti-fascists from the southern town of Niš carried out a different kind of public action in April 2013. Earlier that year, fascists had spray-painted swastikas all over a statue of the famed Roma singer Shaban Bayramovic. Anti-fascists responded by organizing a cleaning action to restore the statue. They left behind a sign that read, "Long live Shaban, death to fascism." The publicity of this action turned this Roma pop singer into an anti-fascist symbol. Other anti-fascist tactics target online fascist organizing. An American anti-fascist recounted a highly successful long-term campaign that his group had helped organize in the early 2000s to infiltrate and destroy a large national far-right network that thrived on intimidating and harassing leftists. While taking rigorous security precautions, the anti-fascists made a number of fake profiles of themselves on the far-right group's online forums and started to share doctored photos of fake actions that these fake members had allegedly carried out. As time passed, the undercover anti-fascists came to constitute fake groups that were awarded chapter status in several locations. One of the anti-fascists even gained enough clout to enter the organization's central board and gain access to all of the group's information files, including their profiles of leftist targets. Once the organization had been thoroughly infiltrated, the anti-fascists revealed their scheme. This generated so much distrust and infighting that the organization collapsed soon thereafter. In Copenhagen, starting in the 1990s, Antifa concocted a very simple scheme that turned out to be quite successful. They called the parents of fascist teens to let them know what their children had gotten caught up in. Danish Antifa also created an exit group to help Nazis who wanted to leave their movement. My Danish Antifa source Ole told me that in the 90s, the pressure Antifa put on fascists would sometimes lead them to write hostile emails to the anti-fascists with threats. Rather than ignoring them, Danish anti-fascists would engage with the fascists as a psychological tactic to nudge them toward leaving their group. After a while, a significant number would start to talk about how they had grown disillusioned or how they just had a kid and wanted to get out. Over time, the anti-fascists would come up with ways for the disillusioned fascists to prove their sincerity by sharing information about their organization or upcoming actions. Once the given Antifa group was satisfied, they would inform other Antifa groups that the individuals had made a clean break with their former fascist friends.
Right.
Should we switch it tighter?
Discussions of violence in the context of anti-fascism or any other topic must address issues of masculinity and feminism. As the Norwegian Antifa Dag remarked, "Whenever violence is part of the political struggle, you will have problems with machismo." He cited his experience organizing in Oslo and Trondheim, where anti-fascist groups sometimes allied with apolitical football hooligans to fight the Nazis, alliances he feared ran the risk of exacerbating macho dynamics. But no matter the country, My interviewees were unanimous about the problem of machismo, especially in the 80s and 90s, though they pointed out that it was usually not much worse than in the rest of the left, let alone in society at large. Paul Bowman of Leeds AFA recounted that such dynamics actually worsened in his group as the membership transformed from mainly students and unionists to ex-hooligans. It became a bit of a boys' club with a few token women. Unfortunately, the classic AFA arrangement, according to Bowman, was for the women to scout the opponent, while the men drank in the pub until it was time to fight. Though unevenly, feminist ideas gradually penetrated the Antifa movement in various countries in the late 1990s. Swedish AFA co-founder Magnus explained that in the 90s, the Swedish and other Northern European movements were heavily influenced by the writings of Klaus Wiemann. While serving 15 years in prison, several in isolation, for direct actions as a part of 2 June movement, a German urban guerrilla group, Wiemann tried to conceptualize a way to connect the feminist, anti-racist, and social revolutionary left in Germany. He was especially intrigued by the writings of Hazel V. Carby on the concept of triple oppression, popularized by the black communist Claudia Jones in the 1960s. He analyzed the experience of the black woman under capitalism, patriarchy, and white supremacy. 2 years before his 1993 release, Wiemann published 3 into 1, The Triple Oppression of Racism, Sexism, and Class, based on discussions with various comrades in prison that synthesized the black feminist concept of triple oppression with autonomous and anti-authoritarian politics. Over time, the term triple oppression faded as leftists began to talk about interactions of oppressions more broadly. Eventually, Madness recounted, more and more adopted the term intersectionality, coined by the law professor Kimberly Crenshaw in the 1980s. And by the late 1990s, he observed, women played leading roles in many Swedish Antifa groups. Confirming this, Dolores C. from Stockholm AFA remembered how the women in her group met every other week to discuss patriarchal behavior exhibited by the men. Almost everyone was involved in gender-based discussion groups during this time, she remembered. Dolores also remembered, with a laugh, how whenever Antifa women beat up Swedish Nazis, the Nazis would always lie and say it had been men. For Dolores, anti-fascist violence could be very empowering when you've been raised to believe you're not capable. In the United States, Maya from Central Texas ARA bemoaned the tendency of men in her group in the late 2000s to assume that their women comrades needed protection. As a result, Maya and other women enjoyed taking advantage of an unwritten rule in the state of Texas that apparently states that if a man lays a hand on a woman, she gets free rein to beat his ass and not get in trouble. With that in mind, Maya and other women exploited the misogyny within the broader culture by provoking fascist men into shoving them, thereby giving them the green light to unleash their fury before the police took the men away. According to Maya, none of these Antifa women did any jail time in Texas, except one who was locked up for a single night after she bit off a chunk of a Nazi's ear. Yet even when carried out by women, such violence can draw backlash from within the left. As Christie, formerly of Rose City Antifa in Portland, Oregon, remembered, many leftist or liberal opponents to Antifa would conflate militancy, even nonviolent militancy, with machismo. This was insulting and personally infuriating. These attempts to circle around and take potshots from a more radical position usually rested on a foundation of gender essentialism. At its core, they believed our women-led group wasn't appropriately feminine enough. Whether excluded from militancy or critiqued for taking part, women face a variety of gendered challenges when they take an active part in the anti-fascist movement. This is part part of the reason why some German Antifa have created feminist groups called Fantifa. Any movement that engages with violence must remain vigilant against the tendency for the violence to overtake political goals. This is what allegedly happened with some ARA groups toward the end of the 2000s, according to New Jersey ARA organizer Howie. In his opinion, the culture of insurrectionary machismo became more central over time to the point where it started to feel like a highly political gang that was more into fighting than winning. Other anti-fascists I spoke with were highly attuned to this pitfall. An RCA member complained about an overemphasis on the black bloc by new anti-fascists without considering it in a larger strategic framework. If all you have is a hammer, she observed, all your problems look like nails. Despite common misconceptions, the black bloc is not an organization or specific group. It is a tactic of anonymous, coordinated street militancy used predominantly, though not exclusively, by anarchists and other anti-authoritarians that originated in the 1980s among the German Autonomen. The rationale for the black bloc tactic is simple. In an era of constant surveillance, militant tactics require some level of anonymity. While masking up and wearing uniformly black clothing do not always entirely conceal one's identity, failing to do so drastically increases the odds of being identified by the police and/or fascists. Paul Bowman recounted how British anti-fascists disagreed with the black bloc tactic. As he explained, in AFA, we encourage people to avoid dressing in black because it makes you look very visible in a large crowd. Instead, we encouraged people to dress like football casuals because we wanted the police to be unsure if we were fascists, anti-fascists, or football hooligans. It is true that in a large crowd of normally dressed people, the police can home in on a mass of black. But advances in video surveillance, facial recognition software, and the pervasiveness of smartphones have made it so that any public political moment can be more closely scrutinized later. Partly as a result, a London anti-fascist named Jim explained to me the methods and style of British anti-fascism have changed in recent decades. Jim began his anti-fascist militancy with a group called No Platform, which followed AFA before co-founding its own mainly anarchist successor group called Antifa around 2002 or 2003. Jim chose the name Antifa after hanging out with anti-fascists in Germany and taking in their Europunk aesthetic. As opposed to AFA's reclamation of the red triangle symbol used by the Nazis to label communists, Antifa incorporated the name, style, flags, and other symbols of continental anti-fascism while maintaining the AFA organizing model. Antifa was largely crushed by state repression around 2009 following 2 trials for conflicts with boneheads. Several years later, it was followed by the anti-fascist network AFN, which still operates today. Jim now belongs to London Anti-Fascists, which was formed in 2013 and is affiliated with the AFN. Jim and his comrades mask up for some demonstrations and not others. Casuals usually make more sense when a dozen Antifa need to carry out a specific action, he explained. But black bloc methods can be effective with marches in the hundreds. Similarly, anti-fascists in Madrid often march without masks in large symbolic demonstrations, while saving the bandanas and balaclavas for confrontational actions. There are a number of legitimate critiques of the black bloc. It is certainly not the best choice for all political situations, but rather than evaluating it in the abstract, it makes more sense to assess its strengths and weaknesses when faced with specific political contexts. As I argued in Translating Anarchy, historically, groups and movements that sometimes form black blocs have managed to gain some measure of public support and the rationale behind the formation of the bloc has been intelligible. Some of the most notable examples have come from the use of the Black Bloc in defense of squats, outrage at police brutality, and opposition to Nazis. Over recent decades, Turkish migrants in Germany or Syrian refugees in Greece have recognized that at times some of the only people standing between them and fascist violence happen to be wearing black. Although the media backlash against recent anti-fascist blocs has been strong, particularly in the United States, the fact that some have publicly defended, or at least sympathized with black blocs, such as those that shut down Milo Yiannopoulos or confronted alt-right Sieg Heiling demonstrations in Berkeley, demonstrates that at the very least, this form of militant anti-fascism is in the process of establishing some measure of public intelligibility. The pastel bloc of masked-up street medics with anti-fascist shields wearing pastel colors in the Bay Area is a recent creative variation on this theme. The anti-fascists I spoke with tended to argue that there was a far greater degree of sympathy for Antifa among progressives than the media recognized. Murray from Baltimore argued that people tended to see the importance of Antifa in prohibiting the growth of people who, if given the opportunity, would like to murder them all. In his opinion, within the broader left, militant anti-fascism acts in the same kind of space that sabotage exists in the labor movement. People may not acknowledge it publicly, but they can see its tangible benefits on the ground. Similarly, in many European contexts, anti-fascism is absolutely necessary to create space for other leftist organizing. Camille from Scalp Besançon told me of an instance in 2008 when 30 Nazis attacked a demonstration of postal and hospital workers. The police were nowhere to be found, but a dozen local Antifa charged the Nazis and beat them back as they faced each other across a narrow bridge. According to Camille, all the workers from the hospitals and the post office applauded us and were very happy to have young anti-fascists by their side. Likewise in Sweden, where an activist named Stina, who organized with No One Is Illegal in Stockholm in the late 2000s, remembered how Nazi violence was ever present, and she recalled Antifa protecting one immigrant rights demonstration from Nazis with knives and bottles. Regardless of people's personal thoughts on Antifa strategy, she said, there was a general understanding that we needed that direct and more confrontational activism. It wasn't just the self-defense that made communities more creates. It was dispelled when small groups of anti-fascists had a chance to organize and establish meaningful relationships in a community. To some extent, that public perception of militant anti-fascist tactics may also be colored by class distinctions that the Antifa community work could penetrate. For example, back in the United States, ARA co-founder Kieran believes that most working class people respect folks that stand up and are willing to defend themselves. Still, despite his support for militant small group Antifa organizing, Kieran, who now organizes with the more public-facing Twin Cities IWW GDC, argues that people try to divide the concept of a mass from a militant response, that it's only possible to do one or the other. And I think that we really want to challenge that. What we think is needed is both popular organizing and anti-fascist confrontation.
So that my feet are not pointing.
Other anti-fascists I spoke with agreed. XTN, who was active with Chicago ARA in the 90s, said, if we continue to function on a small-scale affinity group model, then we're not addressing questions of how we interact with broader communities under attack. Dominic from Germany agreed, emphasizing the need to transcend isolated subcultural politics in order to engage the losers of neoliberal politics who might be sympathetic toward fascism. Dolores C. from Sweden concurred, arguing that anti-fascism requires that we build movements to show our solution to popular issues. Anti-fascists have, in fact, engaged in popular politics in a variety of ways. Some groups have participated in coalitions with unions, political parties, and community organizations to stage mass resistance to Nazi marches in Dresden, Salem, Roskilde, and elsewhere. But not all Antifa agree on this strategy. The Norwegian Antifa Dag recounted how organizing with mainstream political parties to block neo-Nazis in Trondheim drew the ire of some Swedish Antifa who refused to work with liberal parties. It was a reaction Dag strongly opposed. According to him, the Antifa goal is to isolate the fascists entirely. Militant Antifa in Norway, he explained, have been aware that you need both strategies. You can't only be militant and only work with the radicals that agree with you. Luis of Germany's Antifascistische Linke International in Göttingen told me that many autonomous Antifa had joined a more public radical platform called the Interventionist Left, Interventionistische Linke, partly to have an amplified voice in politics. Ironically, he pointed out, many of the most active organizers behind the popular anti-Nazi blockades in Dresden were militant Antifa, because you need coalition building to allow yourself the tactical space to achieve the political goal and to send the message to the government that if they protect Nazi demos, we're going to burn your city to the ground. We could only do what we do and get away with it, Luis said, because of that interplay between mass protest and militant action, because it would have been easy for the German police to shut down more isolated black blocs. Still, Luis was also critical of the mass blockade because in the absence of an anti-capitalist critique, they ran the risk of simply echoing the German state's official anti-fascism. In France, militant anti-fascists worked toward merging small group militant action with broader mobilization by working through intermediary and mass level assemblies. As Camille from Besançon explained, the first level of organizing is the Antifa Radical Group, and the second level is the Antifa Collective, such as Vigilance 69 in Lyon or Comité Antifa Saint-Étienne, mixing people from unions and community activists. Organizers in Toulouse are currently experimenting with a third level, the Anti-Fascist Assembly, which groups together other activist and leftist organizations with Antifa collectives. Even when inactive, these larger bodies act like cells of vigilance that are ready to be activated in case of Nazi activities, says Camille. She says French Antifa participate in these larger collectives to develop anti-fascism in civil society as a tool for people to discover theoretical and practical tools for struggling. In Spain, too, similar organizational models have been put into practice. In response to the emergence of the fascist Hogar Social in Madrid around 2015, members of the Popular Assembly Carabanchel, an outlying neighborhood of Madrid, who were affiliated with the 15M movement, created an open Asamblea Antifascista with allies in the housing movement, neighbors, and assorted radicals. The new assembly distributed a pamphlet exposing the neo-Nazi affiliations of the Hogar Social members and held intercultural celebrations such as anti-racist hip-hop festivals to appeal to youth. They also organized a large demonstration under the slogan, Barrio para Todas, the neighborhood for everyone, that inspired other assemblies to organize their own demonstrations. The most notable was Madrid para Todas, Madrid for everyone, which was a large assemblage of neighborhood assemblies that brought thousands of people out onto the street on May 21st, 2016, behind pink and black anti-fascist flags to emphasize their opposition to machismo. For Danielle, a Carabanchel anti-fascist organizer, the open popular struggle of Madrid para Todas and the more militant direct actions of smaller, security culture-oriented Antifa groups represent the two faces of anti-fascism, and we don't forget either face. These two struggles are parallel to each other, he said, but they do not mix directly. Many militant anti-fascists have occasion to put on both faces, but they take care to distinguish between the two. Many anti-fascists aim to transcend the dichotomy between official Antifa and the rest of the population. Ole from Denmark lamented this problem in the 90s, when leftists started to see Antifa as professionals who take care of the Nazis for the rest of us. We can't be part of them. We just call them when the Nazis come. In that way, Ole suggested, the presence of militant Antifa could make others less likely to organize against the far right. My source, Ian from New York, said he felt the same fear. So to move with no platforming, researching, and identifying threats so they can self-organize. In 2009, the Dutch anti-fascist movement was forced to put these principles into practice when the fascist Dutch People's Union, NVU, moved their marches from major cities to smaller towns to appeal to a wider population. The anti-fascist/autonomous movement, which had been at a low point because of the suppression of squats and, frankly, burnout, was forced to shift its focus toward mobilizing local populations to physically oppose the fascists. The strategy was called Laat ze niet lopen, do not let them walk. Once the location of a march was publicized, a crew of 10 to 12 Antifa would travel to the town, establish contacts, put up posters, and set up an office offering legal and press resources. On the day of the fascist demonstration, organizers would pass out maps with a phone number for the latest news and directions and post the information online. The Dutch Antifa Jo Polak remarked that the strategy was in general surprisingly effective because a critical mass of groups like the local immigrant youth, the local football hooligans, and the traveler community would come out in their hundreds and put pressure on the Nazi march in a way that even a bloc of veteran autonomous militants never would, by chucking everything and anything at them, including piles of dog shit in their faces. Such tactics successfully shut down NVU mobilizing. Granada Actua, Granada Takes Action, is an anti-fascist affinity group that aims to generalize this kind of resistance in Spain. Formed in early 2017 in response to the spread of Hogar Social to their city, the members of Granada Actua chose not to film themselves as a typical Antifa group. Instead, they chose a more general name and eschewed covering their faces. Carpa from Granada Actua acknowledged that revealing their faces was dangerous, but said, "We believe that going with our faces covered or escorted by lines of police distances us from the people. We don't criticize those who decide to cover their face, but in Granada Actua, we don't do it." The group's goal, he said, is to raise the consciousness of the working class so that they can be the ones to throw the fascists out of their neighborhoods. In fact, shortly after the group's formation, the police had to escort Hogar Social members out of a Granada neighborhood to protect them from an angry crowd, including apolitical people. Some American anti-fascists aim to similarly merge militancy and popular organizing. Examples include the IWW GDC, Redneck Revolt, and the Workers' Defense Guard in Vermont, although New Jersey ARA veteran Howie argues that the two forms of organizing cannot be entirely merged into one group. In his opinion, people have to pick a side, either confrontation within a tight-knit affinity group model or a class model and rein in the street brawling. Although GDC organizers aim to merge militancy with mass participation, Eric D. from the Twin Cities acknowledges that public groups can't be as directly confrontational much of the time. Getting there requires a long-term strategy to move people from relative comfort to greater militancy. According to a member of Rose City Antifa, however, anti-fascism is really in many ways the antithesis of mass movement building, because Antifa often find themselves in the unpopular position of calling out fascist entryism in the left. On one occasion, RCA got a serious amount of flack from the local left for revealing that a popular hippie involved in a local co-op had become an anti-Semitic conspiracy theorist who regularly attended Holocaust denial events and other far-right gatherings. Overlooking this would have made RCA more popular with the local left, but in such cases, the goal of Antifa organizing is to serve as a wedge, as former RCA organizer Christie phrased it, to break the bonds that connect racists to the community. That having been said, Christie also notes that public support can be absolutely vital. Having your city, or at least parts of it, on your side means you have eyes on workplaces, colleges, or neighborhoods beyond your immediate circles. If someone is putting up homophobic stickers in one area, someone who lives there will send your group an email. If someone's classmates started trying to recruit for a white student union, you will hear about it. More people will call if they support the work your group does. If one of your members is arrested or hospitalized, more people will donate. Rather than imposing what is essentially an electoral mindset of appealing to the lowest common denominator in relation to the fascist threat, anti-fascists prioritize working with marginal communities to neutralize any potential threats, whether it's popular with the majority or not. This perspective is especially important in anti-fascist work, given the historical fact that those who have suffered the most under fascist regimes have not had the backing of most of the rest of society. Instead of starting with public opinion and working backward towards strategies and tactics to placate the majority, like politicians, anti-fascists start with the immediate task of combating the far right. Sometimes that involves mobilizing working class and immigrant communities. Sometimes it does not. But either way, anti-fascists believe that developing substantive popular support must stem from anti-fascist politics and anti-fascist action, not the other way around. Everyday anti-fascism. The exceptional spectacle of anti-fascist organizers confronting Nazis is not enough to stem the tide of Trumpism. Moreover, even the success of such physical militancy relies in part on its public reception. Therefore, we must pair our focus on organized anti-fascism with an understanding of a deeper everyday anti-fascism that dictates the terrain upon which such struggles occur. In order to understand everyday anti-fascism, we must bear in mind that the fascist regimes of the past could not have survived without a broad layer of public support. Over the years, historical research has demonstrated that the process of demonizing the marginalized required the privileging of the favored, making many explicit or implicit allies for Mussolini, Hitler, and other leaders. If fascism required societal support for the destruction of artificial bourgeois norms, such as the rights of man, in developing its hypernationalism, then today we must be alert to the ongoing campaign to delegitimize the ethical and political standards that we have at our disposal to fight back. In the United States, after Trump's victory, for example, we've had a dangerous mix of mainstream conservatives who do not want to appear racist, and alt-right realists who all accuse the left of so overusing the term racism that it is rendered meaningless. In other words, no one is racist anymore, or we are all racist now. It all presents a major difference between the previous paradigm, where the left accused the right of being racist, and then the right accused the left of being the real racists because they focused so much on race. all amid a developing paradigm where the alt-right and those they have influenced try to drain all power from the accusation. Everyday fascists are the ardent Trump supporters who tell it like it is by actively trying to dismantle the taboos against oppression that the movements for feminism, black liberation, queer liberation, and others have given actual blood, sweat, and tears to establish as admittedly shoddy and far too easily manipulatable bulwarks against outright fascism. These social norms are constantly contested and are unfortunately subject to resignification in oppressive directions, such as when George W. Bush sold the war in Afghanistan as a crusade for women's rights. Yet the fact that politicians have felt the need to engage with the norms that popular resistance have established means that they left themselves open to political attacks on grounds that they at least tacitly acknowledged. A major concern with Trump and the alt-right, however, is that they hope to drain these standards of their meaning. Liberals tend to examine issues of sexism or racism in terms of the question of belief or what is in one's heart. What is often overlooked in such conversations is that what we truly believe is sometimes much less important than what social constraints allow us to articulate or act upon. This issue is at the center of questions of social progress or regression. While one should always be wary about painting large groups of people with a broad brush, it is clear that ardent Trump supporters voted for their candidate either because of or despite his misogyny, racism, ableism, Islamophobia, and many more hateful traits. There is certainly a significant difference between because of and despite in this context, and sensitivity to the difference should attune us to the importance of mass organizing, which can divert potential fascist sympathizers away from the far right. It is always important to distinguish between ideologues and their capricious followers, yet we cannot overlook how these popular bases of support create the foundations for fascism to manifest itself. Everyday anti-fascism applies an anti-fascist outlook to any kind of interaction with fascists, everyday or otherwise. It refuses to accept the dangerous notion that homophobia is just someone's opinion to which they are entitled. It refuses to accept opposition to the basic proposal that Black Lives Matter as a simple political disagreement. An anti-fascist outlook has no tolerance for intolerance. It will not agree to disagree. To those who argue that this would make us no better than Nazis, we must point out that our critique is not against violence, incivility, discrimination, or disrupting speeches in the abstract, but against those who do so in the service of white supremacy, heteropatriarchy, class oppression, and genocide. The point here is not tactics, it is politics. If the goal of normal anti-fascist politics is to make it so that Nazis cannot appear uncontested in public, then the goal of everyday anti-fascism is to increase the social cost of oppressive behavior to such a point that those who promote it see no option but for their views to recede into hiding. Certainly this goal had not been fully accomplished by a long shot prior to the rise of Trump, but his election and the growth of the alt-right has made this task a matter of life and death. Ricky John Best, Talishan Mirden, Namkai Meche, and Micah Fletcher were everyday anti-fascists who answered the call by defending two young women, one a Muslim wearing the hijab, from a white supremacist on a train in Portland, Oregon in May 2017. Tragically, the attacker, who had attended an alt-right free speech march a month earlier, slashed the everyday anti-fascists with a knife, killing Best and Meche and hospitalizing Fletcher. Their heroic examples epitomize the daily vigilance against bigotry that we should all live up to. Changing hearts and minds is ideal and can happen. One striking example occurred with the case of Derek Black, the son of the founder of the Nazi Stormfront site who disavowed white supremacy through conversations with friends at the New College of Florida. But apart from the rareness of such a development, one point that should be remembered is that Derek Black's white supremacist ideas and the anti-racist ideas of the new college students he met did not meet each other on an equal playing field. Black was embarrassed about being a neo-Nazi, and that fact only came out once others publicized it. Why was he embarrassed? Because Nazism has been so thoroughly discredited that he felt like he was in a tiny minority, at odds with everyone around him. In other words, the anti-racist movements of the past constructed the high social cost that white supremacist views carried, thereby paving the way for someone like Derek Black to open himself up to an anti-racist outlook. Hearts and minds are never changed in a vacuum. They are products of the worlds around them and the structures of discourse that give them meaning. Anytime someone takes action against transphobic, racist bigots, from calling them out to boycotting their business, to shaming them for their oppressive beliefs, to ending a friendship unless someone shapes up, they are putting an anti-fascist outlook into practice that contributes to a broader everyday anti-fascism that pushes back the tide against the alt-right, Trump, and his loyal supporters. Our goal should be that in 20 years, those who voted for Trump are too uncomfortable to share that fact in public. We may not always be able to change someone's beliefs, but we sure as hell can make it politically, socially, economically, and sometimes physically costly to articulate them. Conclusion. Good night, white pride, or whiteness is indefensible. First they came for the Muslims, and we said, "Not this time, mother effers." Popular slogan from protests against the Trump travel ban in early 2017. In late January 2017, thousands of protesters swarmed international airports across the United States to protest and physically disrupt the implementation of Donald Trump's Muslim ban. Following the rise of fascism to the second most searched for word on the Merriam-Webster website in 2016, behind surreal, many protesters associated the Muslim ban with Nazi anti-Semitism, and therefore sought to put the wisdom of Martin Niemöller's classic, "First they came for the communists," quote into practice by standing up for the first to be persecuted. "Not this time, motherfuckers," is exactly the right kind of response to the persecution of any group, and Niemöller's famous statement deserves credit for inspiring many to take such a stand. If the historical record shows that if you were an average person of the dominant demographic in Nazi Germany, fascist Italy, or most other authoritarian regimes, they would almost never come for you. As Eric A. Johnson and Karl-Heinz Reuband conclude in What We Knew, far from living in a constant state of fear and discontent, most Germans led happy and even normal lives in Nazi Germany, although most of those we interviewed violated the ubiquitous laws of the Third Reich at one point or another. Most tell us that they did not fear being arrested. Anti-fascists must not only concern themselves with those who organize on behalf of white supremacy and those who casually parrot racist slogans, but also those who never say anything at all. Fascist regimes thrive on widespread support, or at least consent, by cultivating pride in and fear of the loss of a variety of identities, privileges, and traditions. One of the most important in the context of the resurgent far right in the United States is whiteness. Despite the popular perception that race is natural or timeless, the biological notion of race is a modern European invention. As Ta-Nehisi Coates points out, and the process of naming the people has never been a matter of genealogy and physiognomy so much as one of hierarchy. Whiteness has never existed independent of its location at the top of the racial hierarchy. Thus, as Joel Olson explained in The Abolition of White Democracy, white or Caucasian is not a neutral physical description of certain persons, but a political project of securing and protecting privileges. The preeminent position of whiteness atop the racial hierarchy that birthed it makes it an identity of a very different sort from blackness, for example, which was the direct result of the destruction of the identities of kidnapped Africans who were placed on the bottom of the hierarchy. Whiteness is a moral choice, for there are no white people, James Baldwin explained, and we who are not black before we got here either were defined as black by the slave trade. My Jewish and Irish ancestors were not considered white when they first arrived in this country in the early 20th century, but over time they were gradually welcomed into what Joel Olson terms white democracy. The meaning and boundaries of such social constructs shift over time, but we have the power to strike back at the racial hierarchy that underpins the very essence of whiteness. This does not mean adopting a conservative, colorblind outlook, but rather targeting sources of white privilege and struggling in solidarity with the disinherited of the world. This does not mean exterminating people who are currently categorized as white, but abolishing the classificatory scheme that renders them so. W.E.B. Du Bois' The Souls of White Folk from 1920 reflects on the horrors of the First World War to point out what the victims of colonialism and imperialism had known for generations. This is not Europe gone mad. This is not aberration nor insanity. This is Europe. This seemingly terrible is the real soul of white culture, back of all culture, stripped and visible today. The advent of fascism only exacerbated such horror. And while many European and American commentators saw the Holocaust and the rise of fascism as a lamentable deviation from the Enlightenment traditions of Western civilization, Aimé Césaire rightly concluded that Europe is indefensible. So too must we add that, as a modern identity forged through slavery and class rule, whiteness is indefensible. The only long-term solution to the fascist menace is to undermine its pillars of strength in society, grounded not only in white supremacy, but also in ableism, heteronormativity, patriarchy, nationalism, transphobia, class rule, and many others. This long-term goal points to the tensions that exist in defining anti-fascism, because at a certain point, destroying fascism is really about promoting a revolutionary socialist alternative. In my opinion, one that is anti-authoritarian and non-hierarchical, to a world of crisis, poverty, famine, and war that breeds fascist reaction. When I asked Jim from London Anti-Fascists how to combat popular far-right parties, he replied, "We can't just hope to defeat a far-right electoral project in the way we would defeat a fascist street movement. Instead, we need to be better at our politics than they are at theirs." Undoubtedly, street blockades and other forms of confrontational opposition can be very useful against any political opponent. But once far-right formations have managed to broadcast their xenophobic dystopian platforms, it is incumbent upon us to drown them out with even better alternatives to the austerity and incompetence of the governing parties of the right and left. On its own, militant anti-fascism is necessary, but not sufficient to build a new world in the shell of the old. Appendix A. Advice from the anti-fascists of the past and present to those of the future. I asked many of my sources and interviewees for this book if they had any advice for new anti-fascists based on their experience. What follows is a selection of their responses. I present those quotes without commentary in an effort to create a kind of curated primary source for those starting to organize today against the far right. Some of the pieces of advice contradict each other, but this simply reflects the diversity of opinions within the movement. This is a collection of general advice, not a detailed nuts and bolts how-to guide. After some general points, the section is loosely organized into organizing strategies, intelligence, security, tactics, and internal dynamics. Every situation is different. Niccolo Garuffi, Italy. There's no one piece of advice. Malam Soteriou, Greece. Get in touch with anti-fascist groups in a city near you or in your country or any Antifa anywhere that you respect and ask them how they did it. Antifa International. Don't copy what other people are doing. There's no template. Work with the circumstances you have. Oh, Denmark. Show up and make sure you feel confident that you belong. You do. Eric D., Minnesota. Be willing to make mistakes, but remember that making mistakes has gotten people hurt, jailed, and killed. Murray, Baltimore. Don't lose track of what we're fighting for. Oh, Denmark. The most important thing with anti-fascism is to show up. K. Bull Street, UK. Organizing strategies. The most important thing you can do is never do Antifa alone. Create at least a small group you trust. Murray, Baltimore. If you are alone, you are just a gang. Niccolo Garuffi, Italy. Don't get isolated. Dolores C., Sweden. Building a group on the basis of a circle of friends and later inviting some other people is very effective. K., Poland. Don't just keep adding people to your group. Establish a core. Iggy, Atlanta. The most important thing is the cultivation of solidarity between groups. Eliana Canavelli, Greece. You need to adapt your strategy to the groups you are fighting and to some degree to the place you are operating in. Dag, Norway. Take your time and don't get caught up with ideology. It excludes the people. Try to start from the living together. Be able to talk to your neighbors and establish a presence in your community. Camille, France. The best way to combat fascism is to build a broader left-wing movement. Oh, Denmark. Frame anti-fascism in terms of working-class self-defense. Kieran, Minneapolis. Something that should never be forgotten in the anti-fascist struggle is that to reach the working class and gain their support, you have to have done a lot of work previously. You can't gain the support of your neighborhood running around shouting, "Kill the Nazis." Carpa, Spain. I always thought that it is a total war against fascism, not in a military way. You need to be ready to attack and defend yourself. You have to be prepared, but mainly it's a cultural struggle because fascism grows up in the working class. We have to be present in the working class, in the student movement, workers' organization in the community, and build solidarity networks. Niccolo Garuffi, Italy. You need broader organization with non-militant, non-revolutionary people to isolate and fight the fascists. But if you do have a militant group of Nazis operating in your city, of course you need to organize a more confrontational group to protect people. Dag, Norway. Take seriously all that goes into organizing. Create a democratic space where people can get involved for the first time. Create a culture of solidarity and respect. Kieran, Minneapolis. Sometimes you need a solid group that will be working for years. Sometimes you look for a small group of activists for one action. Sometimes you have to work on the ground anonymously, especially in small cities overwhelmed by a hatred towards minorities, in school, on the street, from the local authorities. Sometimes you can work openly and advocate for oppressed groups uncovered. K. Polling. A group should have a clear view of what they would like to achieve. That is, increase awareness in the community about discrimination, make a specific topic visible in the media, reveal identities of the local neo-Nazi gang members. K. Poland. Everybody who's targeted by fascists should have a way to be involved, though not necessarily in every action. Kristen, Toronto. We strongly recommend against Antifa groups being organized using the open public model of most contemporary activism because of the risk of infiltration. If an emergency situation, such as responding to a fascist public event, calls for public meetings in a traditional mass organizing activist model, this should be kept separate from the long-term group structure. It's going down. One extreme option is to function as a group, but not give yourself a name, and not tell fellow activists what you are doing. Once you have a name, fascists will try to figure out who is in the group. Not having a public face makes your actions even more anonymous. It's going down. Intelligence. Do your research. One of the most effective things you can do as an anti-fascist is to understand your opponent, know where they meet, how they organize, then be effective in how you disrupt them. Jim, UK. Understand which resources the far right have. Gather personal and public information about where they live, work, what they do, which ideas are spread in their societies, to be able to react in the same scale. Jan, Russia. Anti-fascism must be intelligence-led. You cannot do anti-fascism in the abstract. Learn what they're doing, what they're talking about, know which groups to destroy, learn about their internal frictions, work on them, leverage them, divide and conquer. Paul Bowman, UK. See how racism or fascism or other forms of oppression are playing out in your community, because it's not going to look the same from one city to the next. Walter Tull, Montreal. Security. Take security seriously. The heat is real, so it is important to make choices about where your energy is best spent. Howie, New Jersey. Learn how to be secure online. Iggy, Atlanta. Start self-defense and weapons training immediately, because you are confronting people with militarized training. They are prepared for street battle. Maya, Texas. Get in shape. Even though there may not be street fighting at this time, the alt-right encourages their people to get in shape and go shooting. Take self-defense classes and learn how to use guns if you're comfortable doing so. Iggy, Atlanta. Protect yourself and your group from Nazis and repression. Anonymity. Make it impossible for the police or Nazis to trace your individual or collective activities. Camille, France. Insofar as it's possible, Antifa members need to keep a low profile, hide their identities when organizing, and not be overly public about who is in the group, where they live, what the group plans are, etc. The far right has a penchant for targeting individual members of Antifa groups, so safety should always be a top priority. To that end, any public displays of Antifa organizing should be done with faces and identifying body marks, tattoos, birthmarks, etc., covered as much as possible. Antifa, Nebraska. It's encouraging to see lifestyle support for anti-fascism, but at the same time, there's a risk to claiming that for yourself. If you're doing anti-fascist stuff publicly, it might make sense not to use the term Antifa. Ian, New York City. Many don't realize that the visible anti-fascist symbolism is basically code for fight us with knives. People don't want to be caught out wearing some of that stuff out in the wrong cities. Jack, Boston. Tactics. Keep an open mind about tactics and organization to deal with situations as they occur. Murray, Baltimore. Avoid macho traps. It's not about who's toughest. Act with numbers to minimize risk. Luis, Germany, USA. People have to be much more about full-spectrum anti-fascism and choosing the most effective tactics without fetishizing violence. The most important thing is winning. Paul Bowman, UK. It's not a game show called Who's the Toughest Anti-Fascist? All methods complement each other. The guys who fight fascism cannot exist without the theory which is written by those at home writing. Georg, Germany. All groups have to consider how to fundraise. Participating in any local social center helps with booking rooms for fundraising events, but monies can be raised by collection boxes in bookshops, stalls at friendly political meetings and cultural events, or organizing fundraising gigs. Anti-Fascist Network, UK. Prepare legal support ahead of time. Make sure you know a lawyer who is willing to represent anyone who is arrested. Get used to doing political prisoner support. It's going down. Don't give fascists easy victories. It emboldens them. We have canceled mobilizations when we're greatly outnumbered. You need to pick your battles. Luis, Germany, USA. Internal dynamics. Get rid of your ego. Maya, Texas. Have honest discussions about successes and failures. XTN, Chicago. Create a culture of support with each other so people can be honest about their capacity. Member of RCA, Portland. Solidarity is also about supporting your people, so be sure they are fine. If not, think about what you can do instead of pushing them into acting regardless of the circumstances. Antifa is a state of mind, a way of reflecting and critical thinking, also about ourselves, not about black clothes and martial arts. M. Poland. The biggest talkers are the fastest to flip on others. Be wary of those who brag about Antifa. Member of RCA, Portland. Work on internalized white supremacy. Maya, Texas. Keep an open mind about different opinions and don't try to impose your opinion. Create together through consensus. Daniel, Spain. Avoid people who want to be celebrities and are driven by approval. Value people who are quiet, get work done, and are cooperative. Member of RCA, Portland. If someone is more interested in recruiting people to their own group than doing anti-fascist work, get rid of them. It's going down. Ideally, you want a diverse squad with members who have different talents. Some folks will be best used on the front lines in confrontations, usually strong, fit people who can fight if need be. Some folks need to be really good with intel gathering, monitoring right-wing pages, doxing, etc. Some folks need to be good at graphic design for flyer campaigns. Some folks need to be well-versed in security culture, etc. The more diverse your organization is, the better equipped it will be at effectively organizing and staying safe. Brett, Nebraska. Be patient and regulate your emotions. Eric D., Minnesota. Be particularly vigilant against anyone who attempts to pressure young or new members to carry out actions that might put them in unnecessary danger. This is a classic provocateur move with the potential to bring a group down. It's going down. Learn about gender, sexuality, body ability. Do not create more exclusive militant groups. This is not what Antifa means for everybody. M. Poland. This concludes the reading of Antifa, the Anti-Fascist Handbook by Mark Bray. Copyright 2017 by Mark Bray. This book was read by Keith Sarabica. This unabridged recording was published by arrangement with Melville House Publishing and was produced in 2017 by Blackstone Audio Inc., which holds the copyright. Neither this recording nor any portion of it may be reproduced or used for any purpose without prior written authorization from Blackstone Audio Inc. If you would like to obtain a monthly update telling you about new releases, call 1-800-SAY-BOOK. That's 1-800-729-2665. For a complete listing of our titles, visit our website at www.downpour.com. Thank you. Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.